I was 31 when I decided to take a week off and go solo camping in northern Idaho. It was late September 2018, and work had been draining me more than usual that year. I lived in Spokane back then and worked in a warehouse, mostly night shifts, so my days had started blending together. I hadn't really taken time off for myself in a long while, and after a quiet breakdown in the break room one night, I decided I needed to just get away. I wanted to be alone with no cell service, no people, and no alarms. I had a spot in mind, somewhere I'd been to once before with a couple friends a few years back. It wasn't an official campground, just a clearing deep in the forest past Priest Lake. We'd only found it after hiking a few miles off a gravel logging road that didn't show up on most maps. Back then, we were looking for somewhere totally quiet, and we got it. No one around for miles and just trees, wind, and water. We'd named it Flat Rock because of this massive, smooth slab of stone that stuck out over a river bend there. You could lie on it in the sun, and the water ran shallow and quick underneath. That trip had stuck in my head ever since, so I made that my destination. I planned everything out carefully, packed enough food for 6 days, brought my old one-man tent, a small propane stove, a water filter, a foldable solar panel for my GPS, a hatchet, a tarp, and a few other things I knew I'd need. I left town on a Monday morning before sunrise and got to the trailhead by noon. The last few miles of the drive were slow, bouncing over rocks and dodging potholes. I parked my truck just off the edge of the gravel road, shouldered my pack, and started walking. Took me a few hours to reach the clearing. The air smelled like pine needles and cold dirt, and the only sound was the wind pushing through the branches. I recognized the spot instantly. Nothing had changed. Flat Rock was still there, half covered in moss, with the river just as clear and fast as I remembered. I felt something loosen inside me when I saw it. I pitched my tent close to the tree line, just far enough from the water not to risk flooding if it rained. I spent that first evening boiling water for pasta, sipping coffee, and watching the sky darken. The first couple of days were exactly what I needed. I didn't even check the GPS after I set up camp. I spent my time hiking, reading, carving sticks with my knife, and just sitting by the water. I saw deer tracks and a few squirrels, but nothing bigger. At night, the temperatures dropped fast, and I curled up in my sleeping bag with every layer on. It was so quiet at night I could hear the trees creak when the wind picked up. But on the third night, something started to feel off. It started with a noise. It wasn't a loud noise or sudden, just something different. I was lying in my sleeping bag trying to fall asleep when I heard what sounded like a stick snapping. Not a small twig, something thicker. It was probably 20 or 30 feet from my tent, maybe closer. I opened my eyes and held my breath. The forest was still again, but I had the clear sense that something had moved. I told myself it was a deer, maybe a moose. I'd seen a few before in that part of the state, though usually closer to the lake. I stayed awake for another hour, listening, but nothing else happened. I dozed off eventually and woke up sore but fine. In the morning, I looked around the camp. I didn't see any tracks or disturbed ground. Everything looked like it had the night before. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd heard something real. I kept busy to distract myself. Cleaned up camp, gathered firewood, boiled extra water to store. But I kept glancing back toward the direction of the sound, like I expected something to step out from the trees. That afternoon, while I was collecting wood, I found something that bothered me. A bit upstream from Flat Rock, maybe 100 yards into the woods, I saw a tree that had been stripped of its bark in long vertical lines. Not like an animal scratching at it. These were wide, almost parallel strips missing, and they were high up, some about 6 or 7 feet off the ground. The inside of the tree was pale and raw. It didn't look like normal wear or weather damage. I'd seen trees stripped by bears before, but those usually had claw marks, not wide sections peeled off like this. It looked intentional. I stood there for a long time staring at it. Later, I walked further upriver than usual and found another tree just like it. Then another. They weren't grouped together, just one every 100 feet or so, each with those same bare vertical strips, all about the same height. That night, I didn't cook. I ate granola bars in my tent and didn't light a fire. I stayed awake most of the night again, listening. The next morning, I decided to stay within a closer radius of camp. I thought maybe I was overreacting, The trees could have been marked by a Forest Service crew I hadn't heard about. Maybe there was logging planned for next year. Still, I couldn't relax. I kept checking behind me. I started noticing more odd things, little details. A pile of small stones stacked near the river that I didn't remember seeing before. A broken branch leaning against the trunk of a tree at a weird angle, almost like it had been propped there. I tried to convince myself they were just natural. That night was the worst. I went to bed early, maybe around 8 p.m., but I couldn't sleep. My body wouldn't let me. Around midnight, I heard footsteps.
Actual footsteps.
Not crashing through the underbrush like a bear. These were measured and deliberate. I didn't move. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would shake the tent. The steps stopped just outside, maybe 10 feet away. Then I heard breathing. Not heavy or exaggerated, just steady breathing, like someone standing still and watching. I didn't know what to do. I had a knife in my pack, but it wasn't within reach. I stayed completely still. After what felt like forever, the breathing stopped. No footsteps going away, just nothing. I stayed like that until the sky started to lighten. I didn't sleep at all. When I finally unzipped the tent and stepped out, everything looked untouched. No footprints in the dirt, nothing moved. But I knew what I'd heard. I packed up that morning. My hands were shaking the whole time. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just drank some water, rolled up the tent, and stuffed everything into my pack. I kept glancing around the trees, feeling watched. I started hiking out with a knot in my stomach. The trail felt different going back. More narrow, darker, like the trees had closed in. Every sound made me freeze. A branch cracking under my boot made me jump. It was the longest 3 hours of my life. When I reached the truck, I threw my pack in the bed and didn't even brush the dirt off. I drove straight back towards Sandpoint, not stopping once. When I got cell service again, I checked to see if any Forest Service crews were scheduled in that area. There were none. No projects, no logging, no official activity. I didn't report anything. I wouldn't have known what to say. I just drove home, showered for almost an hour, and slept for nearly a full day. In the weeks after, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I kept replaying the breathing, the way it sounded so close. I started reading forums, trying to find similar stories. I found a few posts from people who'd camped off-grid in northern Idaho or western Montana and experienced strange things. Stacked rocks, stripped trees, distant sounds of footsteps at night. None of them had seen anything either, just felt that same pressure, like they were being watched or followed. I haven't gone back since. I still hike sometimes, but I stay on marked trails. I haven't done a solo trip again. Took a long time for me to sleep through the night without waking up in a panic. Some part of me wants to believe it was just some other camper playing a prank, or some weird animal behavior I didn't understand. But it didn't feel like that. It felt like something, or someone, was out there watching me, waiting for something I never wanted to find out. The worst part is knowing I'll never get a clear answer. Nothing ever happened to me, not directly, but it came close, closer than I ever want to be again. That silence in the woods, the kind that feels too quiet, that's something I'll never forget. I went looking for peace and ended up bringing something back with me. Not an object, not an injury, just a memory that still wakes me up some nights, heart racing, ears straining for the sound of breathing just outside my window. I first found the cabin by accident, or maybe it was fate, but that's how it always feels with places like that. It was early autumn of 2018 when I decided to take a break from everything. My name is Marcus, I was 28 then, and living in Spokane, Washington. Work had become a constant grind. Long hours in an office with no windows, endless emails, and a boss who never seemed satisfied. I needed to get away from the noise, the pressure, and the crowded city life. I wanted silence, fresh air, and nothing but nature. I'd always liked hiking and camping, but I was never much of a social person, so I usually went alone. This time, I wanted something more permanent for a few days, a place where I could think clearly without distractions. That's when I started looking online for cabins to rent somewhere remote. I stumbled upon an old listing for a cabin near a small town called Cle Elum, about an hour and a half from Seattle. The photos looked rough but cozy. A little wooden shack nestled in a dense pine forest, close to a small lake. No electricity, no internet, just a wood stove and a well. The description was vague, but it promised privacy and peace, exactly what I wanted. The price was low, probably because it was off the grid and hard to get to. I booked it without hesitation. When I arrived, it was late afternoon. The road ended in a narrow gravel path, which I followed through tall trees thick with red and gold leaves. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles. After a bumpy drive, I saw the cabin. It was smaller than I expected, maybe 20 by 15 feet, with weathered logs and a rusty metal roof. A small porch with a creaky wooden bench faced the lake, which was calm and shimmering in the fading sunlight. The door opened with a groan. Inside, the space was simple. A single room with a wood stove in the corner, a small table, a cot with a thin mattress, and a few shelves filled with dusty cans and an old kerosene lantern. There was a bucket toilet outside and a small pump for water near the back. No phone signal, no power lines, just silence. I unpacked slowly. I'd brought some canned food, a few books, a journal, and my camera. After setting some wood in the stove and lighting a small fire, I sat on the porch watching the lake turn pink with the sunset. The first night was quiet. I heard the wind through the trees, the occasional bird call, and the soft splash of water against the shore. I slept with the door slightly open to hear the night sounds better, feeling strangely safe despite being alone. The next day, I explored the area. The forest around the cabin was thick with pine, fir, and cedar. The ground was soft with moss and pine needles. I walked down to the lake's edge and noticed a small dock, half sunken with missing boards. The lake was cold but clear. I found a small trail leading away from the cabin, winding through the trees and up a gentle hill. The view from the top was stunning. The forest stretched for miles, broken only by the lake's blue water and distant mountains capped with early snow. I spent the day hiking and taking photos. The solitude was peaceful. I found a stream nearby and refilled my water bottle. I took out my journal that evening and wrote about the quiet beauty around me. I cooked a simple meal on the stove, beans and rice, and sat by the fire until it was dark. On the third day, the weather changed. The sky was overcast and heavy with clouds. The wind picked up, making the pine trees sway and creak. I stayed inside mostly, reading and writing, but around late afternoon, I noticed something odd. The silence had been replaced by faint noises, something like footsteps crunching on dry leaves, far but definitely close enough to be near the cabin. I stopped what I was doing and listened carefully. The sounds didn't come from animals. I'd been in the woods enough to know the difference between a deer's light steps and something heavier. These were slow, deliberate, and sometimes paused, like someone was watching me. I didn't panic at first. I told myself it was just other hikers or maybe hunters passing by. But then, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the sounds came closer, moving around the cabin's perimeter. I peeked out through the small window by the door. The woods were dark, shadows stretching between the trees, but I didn't see anyone. I locked the door and pulled the curtains. The wind outside howled and rattled the windows. The footsteps continued, sometimes near the porch, sometimes fading into the distance, then returning. I sat on the cot, heart pounding, trying to stay calm. I thought about calling for help, but my phone had no signal here. The nearest town was miles away, and no one would come out this far in the dark without a real reason. I stayed awake all night, listening and watching. The footsteps never stopped until dawn, when they finally faded away into the morning light. The next few days were tense. The footsteps came back every night, always circling, always just out of sight. I didn't sleep well. I started carrying a heavy hunting knife I found in the cabin's old cupboard. I set up makeshift traps around the porch with branches and cans tied to strings, hoping to alert me if anyone came close. During the days, I stayed near the cabin, only walking the same familiar paths I knew well. I didn't want to get lost or encounter whoever was out there. The feeling of being watched was constant. I caught glimpses of movement through the trees, a flash of dark clothing or a shadow that disappeared as soon as I turned my head. One afternoon, while gathering firewood, I found footprints in the soft mud near the lake. They were large boots, fresh and deep, leading from the woods to the cabin and back again. The prints stopped just outside the door. That night, I couldn't hold it any longer. I knew someone was out there, and they weren't just passing through. I wondered if they were dangerous or just another lost soul like me. I decided to make a plan. The following day, I prepared everything. I gathered my few supplies, loaded the car with everything I needed to leave, and hid the keys in my jacket pocket. I cleaned up the cabin so it wouldn't look abandoned and took down the traps and noisemakers, so whoever was out there wouldn't suspect I was trying to catch them. When night fell again, I sat quietly inside, waiting for the footsteps to start. They came slow and deliberate as always. I kept the door locked and the windows shut. Around midnight, I heard something new, the faint sound of a vehicle engine. It was rough and old, maybe a truck or an ATV, coming from the dirt road I had driven on. The footsteps stopped. The engine grew louder, then faded, then came back again. I realized the person out there had a vehicle and was probably watching the cabin from a distance. Waiting. I didn't want to wait. I needed to leave. I dressed quietly in dark clothes and grabbed my jacket, my phone, and the keys. I waited until the footsteps moved away from the cabin. Then I slipped out the back door, careful to avoid the patches of loose gravel that might make noise. I ran through the trees toward the car. The night was cold and dark, the wind biting my skin. I could hear the faint engine still in the distance, then footsteps rushing closer. Panic hit me like a wave. I broke into a sprint, heart racing, lung burning, reaching the car just as the footsteps reached the edge of the clearing. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. The car roared to life and I peeled out down the gravel road. The headlights cut through the dark forest, and I didn't look back. The ride back was tense. I kept checking the rearview mirror for headlights or movement, but the road behind me was empty. Felt like I'd escaped a trap. When I finally reached the main highway and a gas station with bright lights and people, I stopped and called the police. I told them everything, the footsteps, the vehicle, the feeling of being watched. They took the report seriously, but said there had been no other reports of suspicious activity in the area. I stayed in a motel that night, exhausted and shaken. The next day, I returned to Spokane and never went back to that cabin. Months later, I learned from a local news story that the forest around CLE Elam had problems with illegal logging and some people living off the grid who didn't like outsiders. Some had been caught stealing or threatening hikers. It made sense why someone would be watching me, maybe thinking I was a threat or just wanting to scare me off their territory. The whole experience left me with a strong reminder about how vulnerable you can be in the wilderness, even when you think you're alone and safe. Nature itself isn't scary, but people sometimes are, especially when they want to stay hidden. That cabin, those nights, and the footsteps became something I thought about often. It wasn't a ghost or something unreal, just a very real, very human danger I'd encountered in a place meant for peace. I never returned, but I kept a photo of that lake and the pine trees on my desk. It reminded me both of beauty and caution, how even the quietest places can hold secrets, and how sometimes the scariest thing isn't what's out there in the dark, but who's watching from it. It was the summer of 2007 when I decided to spend a week alone in a small cabin deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. I was 28 then, and after a brutal year working in a demanding office job in Minneapolis, I desperately needed to get away from the noise and the crowds. The city's constant hum was suffocating, and I had long dreamed of escaping to a place where the only sounds were the wind through the pines and the crackling of a fire. So I rented a modest cabin on the shores of a remote lake about a 3-hour drive north, near the small town of Ely. The cabin was old, built sometime in the 1950s, but it was sturdy and functional. It sat on a small clearing surrounded by thick forest on 3 sides and faced the lake. The porch creaked underfoot, and the wooden siding was weathered by decades of wind, rain, and snow. Inside, the cabin was simple. One main room with a small kitchen area, a stone fireplace, and a narrow staircase leading to a tiny loft where the bed was tucked away under the eaves. There was no electricity except for a small solar panel hooked to a few basic lights and a phone line that only worked sporadically. I brought along a small generator for emergencies, along with plenty of food, water, and camping supplies. The first day was peaceful. I arrived in the afternoon, unpacked my things, and wandered down to the lake's edge. The water was cool and clear, reflecting the towering pines that bordered the shore. No one else was around for miles. The only sounds were the occasional call of a loon and the gentle lap of waves against the rocky beach. I spent the evening building a fire outside, cooking can stew over the flames, and watching the stars emerge overhead. The isolation felt like a balm, washing away months of stress. The next few days were uneventful, filled with routine. Long hikes along narrow trails, reading old books I had brought, fishing in the lake, and tending the fire. I had brought a small radio, but the signal was weak, mostly just static or distant voices I couldn't quite make out. Sometimes I felt a strange sense of unease, a vague awareness that the forest was watching me. But I shrugged it off as the natural nervousness anyone might feel when alone in the wilderness. On the fourth night, everything changed. I had spent the day hiking a trail that followed the lake's eastern shore. It was late afternoon when I returned, tired and dirty, with a small haul of fish. I cleaned up, prepared dinner, and settled into my chair by the fire, feeling the warmth seep into my bones as the sun slipped below the horizon. The sky was streaked with pink and orange, and the forest darkened quickly. As the night grew deeper, I noticed something strange. A set of faint, distant noises at first, just rustling in the underbrush far beyond the cabin's clearing. At first, I thought it was just animals, deer or maybe raccoons. But then I heard something else, something more deliberate, the sound of footsteps. Soft, slow steps on the dry leaves and twigs that littered the forest floor. I sat still, listening intently, but the noise faded into silence. I told myself it was nothing, probably a hiker or another camper nearby. But when I glanced around the perimeter of the clearing, I noticed the shadows seemed thicker, almost unnatural. The wind had picked up, carrying the smell of damp earth and pine needles. Around 10 p.m., the noises returned, this time closer and more distinct. Footsteps, slow and heavy, accompanied by the occasional crack of a branch. They circled the clearing. I could see nothing, but the sound moved from one side to the other, as if someone or something was pacing just beyond the trees. My heart rate increased, but I forced myself to remain calm. I checked my phone, no signal. The generator was off and I didn't want to use it yet. I had a small hunting knife in my backpack, which I retrieved and kept by my side, though I hoped I wouldn't need it. Suddenly, I heard a loud snap right outside the porch. I froze, gripping the knife tightly. Then came slow, deliberate footsteps up the wooden stairs onto the porch. I could not see anyone, but the weight of their presence was heavy. The floorboards creaked under their steps. The moon was nearly full, casting pale light that barely pierced the thick canopy. I strained my eyes, trying to see through the darkness. I wanted to shout, to demand whoever was there to leave, but my voice caught in my throat. The fear was raw and paralyzing. Then, without warning, the footsteps retreated. They moved back through the forest, fading as quickly as they had come. For the next hour, I sat awake, watching the shadows, waiting for another sign of the intruder. But the forest returned to silence. The next morning, I found broken branches and footprints in the soft dirt around the cabin. The prints were large, not human. They were irregular, almost like a heavy animal's paws, but the spacing was odd. I compared them to my own boots and the local wildlife prints I had seen earlier. They did not match any animal I knew. I spent the day reinforcing the cabin as best I could. I moved heavy furniture near the door, tightened the locks, and set up a makeshift alarm with cans tied to strings around the perimeter. Still, the feeling of being watched did not go away. The forest seemed alive with unseen eyes. On the fifth night, the noises returned, louder and more persistent. This time, there were multiple sets of footsteps, circling and pacing. The rustling grew closer to the windows, and faint tapping came against the wooden walls. My nerves frayed with every passing minute. In a desperate effort to defend myself, I took out a small flare gun I had brought for emergencies and kept it loaded nearby. I waited, muscles tense, ready to fire at the slightest sign of threat. Suddenly, a figure appeared outside the window. Not a ghost or monster, but a man. He was thin, dressed in dark clothes, and his face was partially hidden by a hood. His eyes glinted with something cold and unsettling. He stared in, motionless, for what felt like an eternity. Then he raised a hand and tapped the window twice before disappearing back into the woods. I did not sleep that night. When morning came, I packed everything quickly. I was shaken and exhausted, but I knew I had to leave. I locked the cabin door behind me and started down the narrow dirt road that led back to the highway. As I walked, I glanced over my shoulder repeatedly, half expecting to see the man following me, but the forest remained quiet. I reached the highway late that afternoon and finally caught a ride back to civilization. In the following days, I called the local sheriff's office and reported what I had seen. They told me the area was known for occasional trespassers, people living off the grid, poachers, or squatters. There had been past incidents of theft and intimidation, but nothing violent. I realized then that what I had experienced was not supernatural, but a very real human threat. The wilderness was beautiful and peaceful, but it was also home to people who did not want outsiders wandering into their territory. Though I never returned to that cabin, I kept in touch with the locals, who reassured me the intruder was eventually caught. He had been living illegally in the forest, preying on campers and hikers. The sheriff's office increased patrols, and the cabin owner installed new security measures. The whole experience changed me. I learned to respect the woods not just for their beauty, but for their hidden dangers. Being alone out there meant relying on my own instincts, staying alert, and never underestimating the people who might be watching from the shadows. Looking back now, almost 15 years later, I'm glad I got out safely. That trip was supposed to be a quiet escape, a chance to find peace in nature. Instead, it became a lesson in vigilance and survival. I never saw the man again, but his presence lingered in my memory, a reminder that sometimes the scariest things are the ones you can't predict, and the real dangers are the ones that walk on two legs. I still cherish the memories of the lake, the stars, and the solitude, but I also carry the knowledge that even in the wildest places, you're never truly alone. It was the summer of 2013 when I decided to take a break from my usual routine and head out on a solo camping trip. I was 27 at the time, living in a small town in northern Michigan. The idea was simple: spend a few days away from the city noise, no phones, no internet, just me and the woods. I had been camping before, but mostly with friends, so this time I wanted to test myself, see how I'd manage alone. I chose a spot deep inside the Hiawatha National Forest, about 2 hours from my house. The forest was known for its dense trees, large lakes, and the occasional wild animal. Not too far from the main road, but isolated enough that I could truly feel the wilderness. I packed my car the night before: a small tent, a sleeping bag rated for the summer nights, a compact stove, some canned food, a first aid kit, water, and my trusty old flashlight. I double-checked everything before leaving at dawn. The drive was peaceful, the roads winding through green hills and small towns that slowly disappeared as I got closer to the forest. When I reached the trailhead, I took a deep breath and felt the fresh pine air fill my lungs. The sun was just rising, casting a warm golden glow through the mist that hovered above the trees. I started hiking with my backpack, about 35 pounds heavy, carrying everything I needed for 3 days. The trail was narrow and rocky in places, but well-marked. I kept my pace steady, my boots crunching on dry leaves and pine needles. The sounds of birds and the distant rustling of small animals accompanied me. After about 2 hours, I found a clearing near a small, calm lake, perfect for setting up camp. The clearing was surrounded by tall pines, their branches swaying gently in the light breeze. I picked a spot on the flat ground, not too close to the water, but close enough that I could see the lake's surface shimmer with the sunlight. The earth smelled rich and damp, and the air was cool despite the rising temperature. I set up my tent carefully, making sure the poles were secure and the rainfly was tight. After that, I collected some dry wood and built a small fire pit with rocks. By midday, I had a small fire going, just enough to boil water and warm some canned chili I had brought. I ate slowly, enjoying the silence except for the crackling flames and occasional bird calls. The lake was peaceful, the surface reflecting the sky like a mirror. I spent some time walking along the shore, dipping my fingers into the cool water. It felt good to be disconnected, away from the constant buzz of city life. As the day went on, I explored the nearby woods a little. I stayed on the marked trails, but sometimes stepped off to look at interesting plants or rocks. I found a patch of wild blueberries and picked a handful. The forest was alive with small sounds: squirrels scampering, the flutter of bird wings, leaves rustling in the wind. I returned to camp before sunset and started preparing dinner. The fire was easier to light now with dry wood and some kindling I had collected. The flames danced, casting long shadows around the clearing. I heated up some instant oatmeal for the next morning and wrapped myself in my sleeping bag once the fire died down. The stars were bright above, scattered across the dark sky like tiny lanterns. The first night passed uneventfully. I woke once to the sound of something moving just outside the tent. Maybe a raccoon or a deer, but I stayed calm, telling myself it was normal wildlife. I fell back asleep quickly. The second day was warmer and sunnier. I woke early, feeling rested. After breakfast, I decided to hike further into the forest, following a small creek that wound through the trees. The trail became rougher with fallen logs and loose rocks. I kept an eye on the path, aware that one wrong step could twist an ankle far from help. The creek was beautiful, clear water rushing over smooth stones, surrounded by ferns and moss-covered rocks. I followed it for a while, stopping to rest and drink water from my bottle. As the sun climbed higher, I noticed the forest grew quieter. The birds were fewer, and the usual rustling of small animals had stopped. I felt a little uneasy but told myself it was just the heat making everything slow down. When I turned back toward camp, I noticed something strange. The trail looked disturbed. Broken branches, footprints that didn't match mine. The footprints were bigger and deeper than mine, and they led both away from and toward my camp. I stopped and looked carefully. They weren't animal prints. They looked like human boot prints. My heart beat a little faster. I scanned the trees but saw no one. I wasn't close enough to the main road for hikers to be common, and I had heard that this part of the forest didn't get many visitors. I debated whether to follow the prints or just go back to camp, but curiosity pushed me forward. I followed the prints for about half a mile. They seemed fresh, the dirt still soft and moist. The trail led to a small abandoned cabin, half hidden by overgrown bushes and fallen trees. I had never heard of a cabin here before. It looked old and weathered, the wood rotting in places. The door was hanging off its hinges. The sight of the cabin made me feel uneasy. I took a few steps closer, scanning the area. There were no signs of recent human activity except for the footprints. The windows were broken, and inside I could see scattered debris, old furniture, rusted cans, and torn fabric. Something about the place didn't feel right. I felt exposed and vulnerable. I decided not to stay long and hurried back toward camp. That afternoon, I kept a closer eye on my surroundings. I double-checked my tent, making sure everything was secure. The forest was quiet again, the sun setting earlier behind the trees. I lit the fire, hoping its warmth and light would keep me safe. Late into the night, I heard noises. Not the usual small animal sounds, but something heavier, like footsteps or branches breaking. They seemed to be moving around my camp's edge, circling slowly. My heart pounded and I stayed perfectly still, listening. I considered packing up and leaving, but it was pitch dark, and I wasn't sure I could navigate the trail safely without daylight. The sounds stopped after a while, and I finally fell asleep, although it was a restless sleep filled with uneasy dreams. On the third day, I woke up before sunrise, still feeling tense. I packed my things quickly, doused the fire, and left no trace behind. I took a different route back toward the main road, sticking to the marked trails. As I walked, I saw broken branches and footprints again, but this time they seemed to follow me. The sense of being watched grew stronger. I increased my pace, trying not to panic. The forest seemed to close in around me. After about 2 hours, I finally reached my car, parked under the tall pines near the trailhead. I breathed a sigh of relief, locked the doors, and started the engine. Driving away, I glanced back at the forest, the trees standing still under the bright morning sun. I realized I had escaped whatever had been following me. It was a mix of relief and lingering fear that stayed with me for days. Back home, I checked online for any reports about the cabin or strange activity in the forest. There was nothing. No missing persons, no police reports, just silence. I never went back to that part of the forest. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark or driving through quiet roads, I think about those footsteps in the dirt, the broken cabin, and the feeling of being watched. I don't know who or what was out there, but I'm certain it wasn't friendly. And that knowledge stays with me, a reminder that sometimes the scariest things aren't monsters or ghosts. They're real people, real threats hidden in the quiet wilderness. I was 34 that summer, just about to turn 35, and I had taken a week off work to go on a solo camping trip. It was something I started doing a few years earlier. I worked a quiet job as a mail sorter in Spokane, Washington, and most days passed by with not much change. I didn't have kids or a partner, and to be honest, I preferred being on my own most of the time. The outdoors gave me something I couldn't really explain. Space, I guess. Quiet, real quiet. And there was something calming about setting up camp, building fires, and just being away from all the constant noise of the world. This year, I decided to try a new place. I picked a spot I found online, in a small, lesser-known section of the Clearwater National Forest in Idaho. It was July 2023, and I left early on a Tuesday morning with my backpack, tent, sleeping bag, a small cooler, and some gear. The plan was to hike in about 5 or 6 miles to a lake I had seen on a topographical map. It didn't even have a name on the map, just a round blue surrounded by forest, sitting at the base of a hill. It looked peaceful and remote, which was exactly what I wanted. The drive from Spokane took about 4 hours, with the last 45 minutes on rough gravel roads that twisted through dense trees. I passed 1 or 2 trucks parked near trailheads but didn't see anyone. When I finally parked, there was no one else in sight. I packed up my gear, locked the truck, and set off down the path. The trail wasn't marked and the area wasn't managed by rangers, but I had my GPS, a printed map, and a pretty good sense of direction. The hike was mostly downhill at first, winding through tall pines and patches of ferns, the sun breaking through the trees in dusty beams. It was hot but not unbearable. Bugs buzzed lazily around me, and I could hear birds in the distance. A few squirrels darted across the path. I was sweating within 20 minutes, but it felt good. Real. After about 3 hours, I reached the lake. It was smaller than I expected, maybe 100 yards across, perfectly round, and so still that it looked like glass. Trees circled the entire shoreline, with a small open patch on the northern side where I set up camp. There was a flat spot perfect for the tent, and just a few feet away, the lake. I set everything up slowly. Tent first, then a small fire ring made from nearby rocks. Then I unpacked my food and gear. I didn't bring anything fancy, mostly canned stuff, trail mix, and a few MREs. The first night was perfect. I sat by the fire after dark, listening to the insects and the occasional splash from the water. Frogs or fish, probably. I watched the flames crackle and pop until I got tired. Then I crawled into the tent and slept like a rock. I woke up with the sun and spent the next day fishing from the edge of the lake. I didn't catch much, just a couple of small trout, but it didn't matter. I wasn't there to fill a cooler. I was there for the quiet. That second night, things started to feel off. It wasn't anything big, just little stuff. I was sitting by the fire again, same as before, when I thought I heard something moving in the trees behind me. It wasn't a big sound, more like a soft crunching, like someone slowly stepping on dry leaves. I turned and looked but didn't see anything. I figured it was a deer or some other animal, and after a while, the noise stopped. Still, I kept glancing over my shoulder until I went to bed. The next morning, I found something strange. A stick had been jammed into the ground near the fire. I didn't put it there. It wasn't a branch that had fallen naturally either. It had been pushed down into the dirt at an angle, like someone used force to stick it upright. I stood there staring at it for a long time. It didn't make sense. I hadn't seen or heard anyone, and this spot was deep enough in the woods that it was unlikely someone had just wandered by without me noticing. Still, I told myself it could have been there and I hadn't noticed. Or maybe an animal had moved it somehow, though I didn't know how. I pulled it out and tossed it into the trees. I tried to go about the day as normal. Went on a short hike, took some photos, read a little, but something about the stick stayed in my head. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing noises, faint ones, but just enough to keep me alert. A branch snapped at one point, not far from the tent. Then there was the sound of something moving through the brush. Not running, but slow, steady. I held my breath and sat up, listening, heart pounding. It stopped after a minute or two, and I eventually lay back down, but I never fully fell asleep again. I got up at first light, dead tired and on edge. When I stepped out of the tent, I froze. My cooler was open. It had been shut and latched the night before, and now the lid was wide open, and 2 of the emeries were gone. I hadn't heard it open during the night. There were no drag marks or animal prints around it. It looked like someone had walked up, opened it, taken what they wanted, and walked off. I looked around, but the ground was mostly pine needles, and I couldn't see any clear tracks. That was when I started to think seriously about leaving. It wasn't just nerves anymore. Someone was out there, watching, maybe even walking through my camp while I slept. I packed up everything except the tent. I figured I'd stay one more night and leave early the next morning. I just didn't want to hike back tired and anxious. That was a mistake. The final night was worse than all the others combined. I built up the fire bigger than usual, trying to keep the area well lit. I stayed close to it, feeling every shift in the wind, every crack of a twig. Around midnight, I heard something again. This time it was clear footsteps, soft but steady, coming from the other side of the lake. I couldn't see much through the trees, but I was sure someone was there. I turned off my headlamp, crouched by the fire, and waited. The steps stopped. Then I heard them again, this time farther to the right, like they had circled part of the lake. I waited there for an hour, maybe more. Nothing, just silence. I finally crawled into the tent, fully clothed, knife in hand, and lay there in the dark. I didn't sleep, couldn't. Sometime near dawn, I heard a soft zip, the sound of a tent zipper. I sat up instantly, heart racing, and lunged toward the flap, knife ready. But no one was there. The zipper was halfway down, like someone had started to open it, then stopped. I leapt outside, spinning around, eyes scanning the trees, but there was nothing. Whoever it was, they were gone. I tore the tent down in record time, barely bothering to pack it neatly. I shoved everything into my pack, grabbed the rest by hand, and took off down the trail. My legs were shaking, and I kept checking over my shoulder. The morning was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no squirrels, just the wind. I walked fast, faster than I should have with all the gear, but I didn't care. I just wanted out. The hike back felt twice as long. I kept thinking I heard someone behind me, catching glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye. But when I looked, nothing was there. By the time I reached the truck, I was soaked with sweat and shaking all over. I tossed everything in the back, locked the doors, and drove until I hit pavement. I didn't stop once, not even for gas. When I got home, I filed a report online with the local Forest Service. I didn't have much to go on, no pictures, no names, no plates, but I gave them the GPS coordinates and told them everything. They followed up a few days later, said they'd check it out, but I never heard back. I don't think they found anything. I haven't gone camping alone since. I still hike sometimes, but always close to home and never overnight. I bought security cameras for my apartment. I lock every window at night. I know it sounds paranoid, But when you wake up in the dark and find out someone was standing inches from you, watching you sleep, it does something to you, changes you. I wasn't hurt, and I got out safe, but I think about that last night more than I want to admit. Someone was out there in the woods with me, not lost, not stumbling through. They knew exactly what they were doing. They watched me, took my food, opened my tent, and I never saw their face, never heard their voice. I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't woken up when I did. I'm glad I'll never know. The year was 1997. I was 26 years old, tired of city noise and the non-stop hum of everyday life. So, I packed up my gear and rented a small cabin deep in the North Carolina mountains, near the Blue Ridge Parkway. The cabin sat isolated in a dense forest of tall pines and oaks, far enough from the nearest road that you could barely hear cars, if any passed by at all. The idea was to get away for 2 weeks, have time to think, write, and clear my head. I arrived late afternoon, pulling my old Chevy pickup up a narrow dirt path that twisted through the trees. The sun was low, casting long shadows between the trunks and lighting up patches of golden leaves on the ground. The air was crisp, fresh, smelling of pine resin and earth. I remember thinking how quiet it was, the kind of quiet that wraps around you like a blanket, deep and thick. The cabin was small, made of rough-hewn logs, with a stone chimney and a rusty metal roof. A front porch ran the length of the building with a few creaky wooden chairs. The door squeaked as I opened it, revealing a simple interior. A wood stove, a sagging couch, a narrow table with a battered lamp, and a small kitchen area with a sink and an old fridge. A single bed lay tucked in a corner. It smelled like damp wood and something faintly sweet, like the pine outside mixed with dust. I unloaded my things and lit a fire in the stove, the crackle and warmth settling in immediately. I had brought some canned food, a few books, a notebook, and a camera. No phone signal, no internet, no distractions. Just me and the woods. I planned to write every day, walk the trails, and maybe catch some trout from the nearby creek. The first few days were peaceful. I woke early, brewed coffee on the stove, and sat on the porch watching the mist drift through the trees. The forest was alive with birdsong and the rustle of squirrels. I spent hours walking along faint trails, breathing in the cool air, letting my thoughts wander. At night, I sat by the fire, writing in my notebook, the only sound the occasional pop from burning logs and the whisper of wind through the branches. But on the fourth day, something shifted. It was late afternoon again when I decided to explore a new trail I hadn't noticed before. The path was narrower, less traveled, tangled with low branches and thick undergrowth. I had to duck and step carefully to avoid thorny bushes. The air felt heavier here, damper. I noticed broken twigs on the ground and small patches where the leaves were flattened, as if someone had been there recently. I pushed forward until I reached a small clearing beside a rocky stream. The water was clear, running fast over smooth stones. I knelt to drink some, feeling the cold water slip down my throat. When I stood up, something caught my eye near the edge of the clearing. Something dark, wedged between two rocks. It was a boot, a single, worn-out hiking boot, mud-caked and torn. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. It looked old, maybe a few years. It didn't belong to me, that was certain. I felt a chill creep up my spine. I looked around the clearing carefully. There were no signs of a camp, no other belongings, no footprints except my own. I dropped the boot back near the rocks and decided it was best to head back. The sky was already turning gray with heavy clouds, and the wind had picked up. I moved quickly, retracing my steps through the thick forest. As I walked, I kept thinking about the boot. Who had lost it here? Was someone else out in the woods? I didn't want to believe that anyone was nearby, not after I'd felt so alone the past few days. Back at the cabin, I checked the windows and locked the door before starting a fire. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, rattling the porch boards. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, darker. That night, I hardly slept. Every small noise, the creak of a branch, the rustle of leaves, made me jump. Around midnight, I heard something else. a faint snapping sound, like a twig breaking close to the cabin. I froze, heart pounding, ears straining in the dark. The sound stopped after a moment, and I told myself it was probably just a deer or a raccoon. The next day was colder and gray. I stayed mostly inside, reading and writing, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. I told myself I was imagining things. On the 6th day, things got worse. I woke before dawn, the room cold and quiet except for a faint tapping sound at the window. I stared through the glass, but saw only darkness and the outline of trees swaying. I pulled the curtain closed tightly. Later, I went outside to fetch some firewood. As I walked around the cabin, I noticed fresh footprints in the dirt near the back porch. They were boot prints about the same size as mine, but I was sure they hadn't been there yesterday. The prints led into the woods, disappearing between the trees. My pulse quickened. I had made sure to lock the cabin. Who could have left them? The nearest house was miles away. I checked all the doors and windows again, making sure everything was secure. Then I loaded my old hunting rifle I had brought for protection, just in case, and placed it near the stove where I could reach it quickly. The rest of the day I stayed inside, keeping the curtains shut, only venturing out when the sun was high. I told myself that maybe a hunter or hiker had wandered close but not seen the cabin. Maybe they were just lost. That night, the tapping at the window came again. Louder this time, more insistent. I didn't look outside. Instead, I sat by the fire, holding the rifle tight, listening to my own breathing. The tapping stopped after a while, but the sound of footsteps circling the cabin started soft, slow, deliberate. Someone was walking all around the cabin, watching me. I stayed frozen until the footsteps finally moved away into the woods. The next morning, I left the cabin for a long walk, hoping the fresh air would calm me. I followed the creek downstream, the water churning over rocks and fallen branches. After an hour, I found a small makeshift camp hidden among the trees. It was rough. Some old cans, a torn tarp, footprints everywhere. There were no people in sight. I looked around for clues. Among the scattered trash was a worn leather wallet. Inside was a faded ID, a name I didn't recognize, and a photo of a man probably in his early 30s. The wallet was dry but dusty. Suddenly, it hit me. Someone had been living rough nearby, maybe for weeks or months, hiding out in the forest. Maybe that was the person who had lost the boot. I returned to the cabin quickly, thinking about what to do. The nearest ranger station was about 20 miles away, and the road was rough. My cell phone still had no signal. I debated whether to call the police or wait it out, but I realized that the unknown person was probably watching me already, maybe even lurking close to the cabin right now. The next night was worse than the one before. The tapping came again, but this time it was joined by low, muffled noises. Shuffling, breathing, something dragging across the porch boards. My nerves were raw. I stayed awake all night, clutching the rifle, waiting for dawn. When morning finally came, I checked the perimeter. The back door lock was scratched and loose, and there were clear marks on the porch floor. Heavy boots dragging something large. I packed a bag quickly with food, water, some clothes, my camera, and the rifle. I left the cabin locked and slipped away before the sun was high. The hike back to the main road was exhausting. I moved quickly but cautiously, constantly looking over my shoulder. I made it to a small gas station where I finally found a working phone and called the police. They arrived the next day with a search team. They combed the forest for miles, looking for signs of the person living rough. They found the camp I had seen and a few more items: old clothes, some empty bottles, and a tattered backpack. But no one. The officers told me people sometimes disappear into the woods, living off the land or hiding for various reasons. The person could still be out there or may have left quietly before the search. I never went back to that cabin after. It stayed rented out for a while, but I heard the owners eventually tore it down after more reports of trespassing and strange noises. Even years later, I remember the isolation. The cold fear of knowing someone unknown was so close, and the silence broken only by footsteps that shouldn't have been there. It taught me how fragile safety can be when you're truly alone, and how the woods hide more than just trees. It was September of 2018 when I decided to take a short solo camping trip in northern Arizona, near the Coconino National Forest. I was 32 at the time, living alone in Flagstaff and between jobs. I just left a stressful position in Phoenix and moved back to where I'd grown up, hoping to reset a little and figure out what I wanted next. I wasn't really looking for some big life-changing moment out there. I just wanted a break from everything. I'd always liked being outdoors. As a kid, my dad used to take me on these weekend hikes and small camping trips in this part of the state. They weren't anything fancy, we'd just pick a quiet spot near the trees and pitch a tent. This trip was meant to be a little like that. Simple, quiet, maybe just 2 nights out there, no distractions. I packed the usual things: a tent, sleeping bag, a small gas stove, food that wouldn't spoil, a good knife, flashlight, water bottles, and a large jug for backup. I also had a satellite phone just in case. I wasn't dumb about safety. The spot I picked was off a forest road that ran about 10 miles into the woods from the nearest highway. There were no marked campsites, but I'd found a clearing on a topographical map that looked flat enough to camp. It sat just above a dry creek bed, surrounded by a mix of pine and oak. I drove in on a Wednesday morning, early enough that the road was still shaded by the trees. The dirt path was rough, but my old Tacoma handled it fine. I parked maybe 100 feet from the clearing and walked the rest of the way in with my gear. Felt peaceful. The sun was filtering through the branches, and there was a slight breeze. I could hear the occasional bird and the rustle of small animals in the brush. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing where the ground was soft but not sloped. After that, I collected some dry wood and set a ring of stones for a small fire, even though I didn't plan to keep it going long. The rest of the day passed slowly. I walked a bit, followed the dry creek bed for a few hundred yards, then circled back when it got too dense with brush. That night was uneventful. I made some pasta over the gas stove and sat by the fire with a headlamp on, reading. I fell asleep sometime around 10, the kind of deep sleep you get after breathing fresh air all day. I didn't wake up until after sunrise. The second day, I went exploring. I took a small backpack, filled it with water and a couple of snacks, and followed a narrow game trail that led east. It looked like deer had used it recently. The trail cut across some low hills and wound through thick clusters of trees. I kept track of my direction with a compass and marked a few trees with a knife so I could find my way back. It wasn't about going far, just far enough to stretch my legs and see something new. I saw some elk droppings and a set of coyote prints, but nothing that made me nervous. I stopped at a ridge around midday, ate a protein bar, then turned back. I was back at camp by 3 in the afternoon. That's when I first noticed something that felt off. My backpack, one I'd left on a stump near the tent, had been moved. Not stolen, just moved maybe 2 or 3 feet from where I'd left it. At first I figured maybe I'd left it like that and didn't remember, but I wasn't the kind of person to toss my gear around. I was careful, especially alone. Still, it wasn't ripped or emptied, so I brushed it off. That night, I didn't sleep as well. I kept hearing noises, which is normal in the forest. Twigs snapping, small rustlings, but this was different. It sounded like something heavier than a squirrel or rabbit. A couple times I sat up in my sleeping bag and just listened. Nothing clear, but I could feel the tension in my neck. Once I unzipped the tent quietly and scanned around with my flashlight. I didn't see anything but trees and brush. No glowing eyes, no movement. The next morning, I was tired and decided I'd pack up and head home early. One night of poor sleep was fine, but I didn't want to push it. I boiled some water for coffee and started packing slowly. That's when I found the footprints. They were faint but clear enough. Not animal, human. Someone had walked around the back side of my tent, stepping in a curved path as if circling. The prints were about the same size as mine, maybe a little bigger, and one of them had a distinct notch in the heel, like a boot with worn-out tread. They weren't mine. I'd been careful to step only in a direct line in and out of camp, and I hadn't walked that close to the rear of the tent. I stared at them for a long time. Now I felt it, the tight pull in my gut, the sense that I hadn't been as alone as I thought. I hadn't seen another person since I left the main road, and this was miles from any trailhead. Whoever had come through hadn't made any noise, hadn't touched anything else, hadn't left a note or sign. They just circled. watching. I packed faster. Tent, gear, food, everything went into the truck in under 20 minutes. I didn't eat breakfast. I just got behind the wheel and drove out. My eyes were on the mirrors the whole time, scanning the trees. I never saw anyone. No vehicles, no hikers, nothing. I got home by noon and took the longest shower I'd had in a while. I felt safe again in my apartment, but the unease didn't go away. That night, I double-checked every lock on my doors and windows. 2 weeks passed. I didn't tell anyone about the prints. I wasn't sure what to say. Maybe it was a hunter. Maybe someone passing through. I kept trying to explain it to myself like that. But then something happened that took the situation from strange to dangerous. One afternoon, I got a knock at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone. I looked through the peephole and saw a man I didn't recognize. Mid-40s, pale, wearing a dark ball cap. His clothes looked worn and dusty. He wasn't holding anything, just standing there. He didn't ring the bell. He didn't say anything. I watched him for maybe 30 seconds. He didn't move, didn't knock again. I stayed quiet. Eventually, he turned and walked away. I waited another 10 minutes before I opened the blinds. He was gone. That's when I started checking my truck more carefully. Every day after work, I'd look under it, inside it, just to be sure. I even installed a dash cam, thinking maybe I was just being paranoid. I also started going to the gym instead of hiking. It was just a phase, I told myself. I'd go back out eventually, just not yet. A month later, I got a call from a sheriff's deputy. They found a campsite in the woods, less than a mile from where I'd stayed. It had been abandoned, but it looked like someone had been living there for weeks, maybe months. There were tarps, food wrappers, a broken rifle, and a journal filled with odd, fragmented entries. Most of it was unreadable, water-damaged. No ID, no signs of who had been there. The deputy asked if I'd seen anything while camping. I told him about the footprints, but left out the part about the guy at my door. He said it matched with other reports. Hikers seeing strange camps, feeling watched, hearing noises at night. They never found the man. At least not officially. I still think about that trip. I think about how close I was to someone I never saw. Someone who may have been watching me the whole time. And what if I hadn't packed early? What if I'd stayed just one more night? I haven't gone back to that part of the forest. I still camp, but only in designated areas and never alone. I still love the outdoors, but I know now how fast things can shift from peaceful to dangerous. It wasn't a ghost or a monster. It was just a person, and that's what makes it worse. I was 34 when I decided to take some time away from everything. Work had been wearing me thin, and after almost a decade in Chicago, the city noise started to get under my skin in a way I hadn't expected. My name's Tom Russell. I worked in marketing back then, but the burnout hit hard that year, 2022, early fall. I needed quiet, somewhere far enough from people where I didn't have to think or be anyone for a little while. A friend of a friend had a cabin up in northern Idaho, not far from Priest Lake. Said it was empty most of the year, and I could use it for as long as I needed. That sounded perfect. The cabin was about 12 miles off the nearest highway, sitting in the thick woods, surrounded by pine and cedar. The closest town was Coolin, and even that was a good drive out. I stocked up on food, filled my truck with supplies, and made the trip up in early October, just as the trees were beginning to lose their leaves. That drive into the woods felt like I was peeling away layers of the world. No cell signal, no traffic, just gravel roads narrowing the deeper I went. It was peaceful, like I was being swallowed by the forest. When I pulled up to the cabin, it looked exactly like the kind of place you'd imagine for something like this, old, but kept up. One story, made of faded logs with a pitched green roof and a small porch out front. It had a single bedroom, a kitchen with a wood stove, and a small living room with a couple old chairs and a stone fireplace. No TV, no internet. The power came from a generator out back, and water was pulled from a nearby well. It was the kind of place that forces you to slow down. The first few days were uneventful. I spent time hiking the trails around the property, making simple meals, reading. The quiet out there had a weight to it, thick and unbroken except for the wind and the sound of branches moving. Nights came early, and it got cold fast. I'd keep the fire going most evenings, listening to the crackle of burning wood, the distant hoot of an owl, and nothing else. I started writing in a notebook, just thoughts at first, little journal entries. I hadn't done anything like that since college. Something about being that isolated made me want to get things down on paper. That's how I remember the order of things. Looking back, day by day, entry by entry. It was the fifth night when I first noticed something strange. Around 2 a.m., I woke up suddenly, not from a sound, but from a feeling. You know that sense you get when you're being watched? That heavy awareness? That's what pulled me from sleep. The cabin was silent. The fire had burned down low, and everything was still. I sat up in bed and waited, not really sure what I was expecting. I didn't hear anything. Eventually, I chalked it up to nerves and went back to sleep. The next morning, I went outside and walked the perimeter, just out of curiosity. The ground was soft with pine needles and some early frost, but nothing looked out of place. There were a few animal tracks, maybe a deer or something smaller. I figured maybe I'd been dreaming. That happens out there with no light pollution and complete silence. You start to fill the void with your own thoughts. But then it happened again the next night. I woke up around the same time, 2 a.m., but this time, I heard something. Not footsteps exactly, but a shift in pressure, a dull thud, like weight on a wooden step. I stayed still, straining to hear more, but it didn't repeat. After a long while, I got out of bed and looked through the front window. The porch was empty. I stayed up for a few hours after that, just sitting in the dark with a flashlight in hand, listening. By day 7, I was uneasy. The woods no longer felt as welcoming. I kept catching myself looking over my shoulder during hikes. Every time I went out, I had this tight feeling in my gut, like something was just out of sight. I found myself coming back to the cabin earlier and earlier, locking the door behind me even though I was miles from the nearest person. That night, I woke again. This time, I heard a definite sound. A scrape metal on wood. Came from the side of the cabin, near the window. I sat up fast, heart pounding. It was pitch dark, but the fire still had some glow. I grabbed my flashlight and stood still, barely breathing. The scraping stopped. I moved toward the front of the cabin slowly, then heard another sound, something tapping against the wall. Not hard, but deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. I didn't open the door. I waited. After maybe a minute, it stopped. Nothing followed. I stayed up the rest of the night, light on, eyes fixed on the window. The next morning, I went outside and circled the cabin. On the north wall, near the bedroom window, I found marks. Scratches. Fresh, long, and shallow. It looked like someone had dragged something sharp across the logs. Not an animal. I knew the difference. These weren't claw marks. They were too clean, too intentional. Like someone had done it slowly, just to mess with me. That day, I walked further out into the woods, searching for signs. Boot prints, a trail, anything. I didn't find much, but about 200 yards east of the cabin, I came across something that stopped me cold. A small clearing with a fire pit recently used. Blackened wood, scorched earth, and something else half buried in the dirt, a food wrapper. The same kind I had in the cabin. I hadn't left any outside. I was sure of it. I took it as a warning. Someone had been watching me, possibly coming near the cabin at night. I packed a bag that evening, planning to head back to town the next morning. But part of me didn't want to leave in the dark. I figured if I could hold out until sunrise, I'd drive out and be done with the whole thing. That night was the worst. Around midnight, the generator cut off. That had never happened before. I stepped outside to check it and immediately felt like something was wrong. The air was colder than usual, the woods too quiet. No wind, no insects, no distant rustle of animals. Just complete silence. The generator looked fine, no leaks, still had gas. I restarted it and went back inside, locking the door again. Maybe 5 minutes later, I heard a knock. Not on the door, on the window. Just one. A soft, single knock. Then another, from the back of the cabin. Then one from the side. different windows, one after the other. My skin went cold. I didn't have a gun, just a hatchet and a kitchen knife. I stood in the middle of the room, clutching the flashlight in one hand, hatchet in the other, trying to listen. The knocking stopped, then footsteps on the porch. Slow, heavy. Whoever it was stood there for a long time. I didn't move. The door didn't rattle. No attempt to get in. Just that weight of presence. Eventually, the footsteps receded. I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark, shaking, until the first light broke through the trees. I left as soon as the sun was up, throwing my gear in the truck without breakfast. I didn't even lock the cabin. I just got in and drove, watching the tree line in the rearview mirror the entire time. I didn't report it to the police. What could I say? Someone scratched my cabin and knocked on my windows? There was no real crime, just a feeling, a presence. Predator circling, watching. A few days later, I got a call from the friend who owned the place. I asked him casually if anyone else had been out there recently. He said no, not since last winter. I didn't mention what happened. I just told him I left early, needed to get back to the city. It's been over 2 years, and I haven't gone back to any cabin since. I still think about that night, though. Sometimes I wake up at 2 a.m., heart racing, thinking I heard a tap on the window. I've changed apartments twice since then, and I keep a baseball bat near my bed. I don't think whoever it was wanted to hurt me, at least not that night. I think they just liked watching, waiting. Maybe they were planning something. Maybe they were testing how long I'd last. Maybe if I'd stayed one more night, they would have come inside. But I didn't stay, and I'll never go back to that cabin again. The night was cold, and the wind had a sharpness to it, making the leaves rustle in an eerie way. I had always enjoyed camping, but something about this trip felt different. Maybe it was the isolation of the campsite, far from the usual crowd, or the fact that I had come alone this time. But as I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest around me seemed to stretch on endlessly, and the only sound was the crackling of the fire and the occasional distant call of a bird or animal. I tried to push the thought away, telling myself it was just my imagination, but it lingered. I had set up my tent earlier that afternoon, a simple 2-person tent that I had used many times before. My gear was scattered around the site: sleeping bag, backpack, a few cans of food. Everything seemed fine, but the longer I sat there, the more I became aware of the silence around me. It wasn't the peaceful kind of silence either. It was thick and heavy, like the air itself was waiting for something. I glanced at the trees, their branches swaying in the wind. The shadows they cast were long and twisting, stretching across the forest floor like dark fingers. I couldn't help but imagine what could be lurking in those shadows, even though I knew it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Still, the feeling of unease gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. As the fire burned low, I decided to get into my tent. The wind had picked up, and the night felt even colder now. I zipped up the tent and settled into my sleeping bag, trying to shake the uncomfortable feeling. The sounds of the forest continued, but it felt like they were getting closer, like the trees were whispering secrets just out of reach. I tried to sleep, but it wasn't easy. The sound of the wind howling through the trees kept me awake, along with the occasional rustle in the underbrush. Every now and then, I would hear something that sounded like footsteps, heavy, deliberate steps, but when I checked, there was nothing there. My nerves were starting to fray, but I told myself it was nothing, maybe a deer or some other animal. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside, and the sunlight had already begun to filter through the trees. I felt relieved, like the worst of the night had passed. I decided to take a walk through the woods, stretch my legs a bit, and clear my head. I packed a small snack and a bottle of water into my backpack, strapped it on, and left the campsite. The trail was narrow, winding through thick trees and underbrush. The forest here was dense, and I could barely see the sky through the canopy of leaves above. I walked for a while, enjoying the solitude. It was peaceful, and the quiet of the forest seemed almost comforting in the daylight. But the further I walked, the more something felt off again. It wasn't like the previous night. There was no immediate danger, no clear threat. It was just a feeling, a sense that I wasn't alone, that someone or something was nearby, watching me from the shadows. I paused several times, turning to look behind me, but saw nothing, just the trees, the rocks, and the underbrush. I continued on, trying to ignore the feeling, until I came across something odd. It was a small clearing, not much bigger than a few yards across, and in the center of it was a pile of rocks. It looked like it had been carefully arranged, not like a natural formation. The rocks were stacked in a way that felt intentional, almost as if they were marking something. I stepped closer, curiosity getting the better of me. As I crouched down to inspect the pile, I noticed something strange. Tucked between two of the rocks was a small piece of cloth, frayed at the edges. I picked it up, and it felt odd, almost like fabric that had been weathered by time. I couldn't tell exactly what it was, but there was something unsettling about it, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I turned it over in my hands, and that's when I saw it. Something carved into the rock beneath the cloth. It was faint, but it looked like a symbol, a sort of jagged pattern that didn't seem like anything I recognized. It wasn't like any typical trail marker, and it certainly wasn't a natural shape. It almost looked like a warning. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt the unease grow in the pit of my stomach. I stood up quickly, brushing off the feeling that had crept up on me. I was starting to feel like maybe it was time to leave, but curiosity pushed me to keep exploring. After all, I had come out here to get away from everything, to clear my mind, not to turn back just because of a strange symbol. But as I looked around, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned around, scanning the trees, but everything was still. The wind had died down, and the forest was eerily quiet again. I shrugged it off and made my way back toward the trail, but the sense of unease didn't leave me. I reached my campsite by midday, and for the first time in a long while, I felt grateful for the sight of my tent and fire pit. I set down my pack and sat down, trying to push away the feeling of being followed. I glanced around nervously, wondering if I was just imagining things. I had no reason to believe I was in danger, but my instincts told me something wasn't right. I spent the afternoon keeping busy, gathering firewood, checking my gear, and even preparing some food. But as the evening approached and the sun began to dip behind the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was closing in around me. It was like the trees had grown taller and the shadows deeper. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. Night fell and I lit the fire again. The crackling flames provided some comfort, but I was still uneasy. I sat there for a while, staring into the fire, listening to the wind, trying to ignore the odd noises that seemed to surround me. It was probably just animals moving through the underbrush, I told myself. There was no need to worry. But then I heard something else, a sound that made my blood run cold. It was faint at first, almost like a whisper, but as it grew louder, I realized it wasn't a whisper at all. It was the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, like someone walking around the campsite. I froze, staring into the darkness, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps weren't like animal tracks. They were too heavy, too purposeful. I jumped to my feet, scanning the area, but there was nothing. No person, no animal, just the shadows and the trees. The wind howled again, but the footsteps, those slow, heavy steps, continued. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the sound, my hands shaking. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but it revealed nothing. No one was there. I didn't know what to think. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe there was someone out there. But something in the pit of my stomach told me that whatever it wasn't friendly. I backed away from the fire, moving closer to my tent, but I couldn't bring myself to go inside. I stayed there for what felt like hours, waiting, listening, and hoping whatever it was would leave. Finally, the footsteps stopped. The forest went silent again, and the air seemed to shift. The tension lifted, and I allowed myself to relax just a little. Maybe I was overthinking everything. Maybe I just needed a good night's sleep. But as I crawled into my tent, I kept the flashlight on and the zipper halfway open, just in case. I lay in my sleeping bag, trying to calm my racing heart, listening to the sounds of the forest around me. The wind had died down again, and the world outside was quiet. My eyes drifted shut, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was still out there. The night passed without incident, and when I woke up in the morning, the campsite was still. There was no sign of anyone or anything strange. I packed up quickly, not wanting to stay in the area any longer. I didn't know if it had been a trick of the mind or if something had really been out there, but either way, I wasn't sticking around to find out. As I walked back down the trail to the parking lot, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The woods had their mysteries, but some things were better left unexplored. When I reached my car and drove away, I looked back one last time at the forest, the place where I had felt so uneasy. But I had survived the night, and that was enough for me. I promised myself I would come back, just not alone. The next day, when I got home, I went through my gear, checking for anything I might have missed. It was then that I found something strange. A small stone in the pocket of my jacket. It was smooth, round, and cold to the touch. I had no idea how it had gotten there, but as I held it, I couldn't shake the feeling that it had something to do with the strange events of the night before. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me wonder if I had really been alone in those woods after all. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth as I drove deeper into the woods. The car's engine hummed, and the road seemed to stretch endlessly before me. It was my first time renting a cabin in this part of the forest, and the excitement of a weekend away from the city was enough to make me forget the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. I had always found comfort in the quiet, the solitude that came with being surrounded by nature. But now, with each mile I drove, that sense of peace seemed to be slipping away. I had booked the cabin online, trusting the glowing reviews and picturesque photos. It was supposed to be a rustic getaway, secluded and peaceful, far from the bustle of everyday life. The place was perfect in every way, except for the road leading up to it. The gravel was uneven, and the trees grew so close that they almost seemed to be closing in on me. The path was barely wide enough for my car, and every few hundred yards, the road seemed to disappear into the underbrush, leaving me wondering if I was going the right way. After what felt like hours, I finally spotted the cabin. It was nestled in a small clearing, a modest wooden structure with a stone chimney that promised warmth on a chilly night. The cabin looked almost too perfect, like it had been placed there just for me. There was no one else around, just the trees and the sound of birds in the distance. I parked the car and grabbed my bags, feeling a slight twinge of unease as I approached the front door. The air was still, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel beneath my boots. Inside, the cabin was just as charming as the pictures had promised. The wooden beams of the ceiling gave it a cozy, rustic feel. There was a stone fireplace on one wall, a large leather couch in front of it, and a small kitchen area tucked into the corner. A few candles sat on the windowsills, and the light filtering through the trees outside gave the room a warm, golden glow. I set my things down and took a moment to appreciate the silence. It was peaceful here, but there was a part of me that couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. The first night was uneventful. I settled in, started a fire in the hearth, and made myself some dinner. The crackling of the wood in the fireplace was the only sound that filled the cabin, and it was a welcome change from the noise of the city. I read a book, then went to bed early, tired from the long drive. The bed was comfortable, the sheets soft, and I quickly drifted off to sleep, the quiet of the cabin lulling me into a deep slumber. But that night, I woke up to something strange. It was a subtle sound at first, something faint, almost imperceptible. It took me a moment to realize what it was. Scratching. It wasn't loud enough to be alarming, but it was persistent. I lay there in the dark, staring up at the ceiling, trying to ignore it. Maybe it was just an animal outside, a raccoon or something, I told myself. But the sound continued, scratching at the walls, at the door, at the windows. It seemed to be coming from all directions, and it was growing louder. I sat up in bed, heart racing, and listened. The scratching stopped for a moment, and for a brief second, I thought it was over. But then came the thud, a heavy, deliberate thud that shook the walls. It was followed by more scratching, louder now, more frantic. My pulse quickened, and I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. I wasn't sure what to do. I could check outside, but I didn't want to open the door, not with whatever was out there making those noises. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I got out of bed and grabbed the flashlight from the drawer beside the bed. My hands shook as I turned it on, the beam of light cutting through the darkness like a knife. I tiptoed to the window and peeked through the blinds. What I saw made my blood run cold. There, just outside the window, was a figure. It wasn't a person, not really. It was tall and hunched over, its features hidden in the shadows, but I could see enough to make out its shape. It was crouched down, scratching at the wall of the cabin with long, spindly fingers. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its arms seemed too long for its body. For a moment, I froze, too terrified to move. My heart pounded in my chest, and I held my breath, praying it wouldn't hear me. The figure moved, slowly at first, then more quickly, as though it had sensed my presence. It turned its head, and for the briefest second, I thought I saw its eyes wide, unblinking, and unnaturally dark. Then it vanished into the trees. I didn't wait to see if it would return. I backed away from the window, my legs weak beneath me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Had it been a person? No, it couldn't have been. The way it moved, there was something wrong with it. It wasn't human. I thought about calling for help, but the nearest town was miles away, and I didn't have a phone signal. I was alone out here, isolated. My only choice was to wait until morning, but I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep again. I spent the rest of the night on the couch, the flashlight clutched tightly in my hand, my ears straining for any sign of movement outside. When the sun finally rose, I felt a bit of relief. The light of day made everything seem less menacing. I stepped outside, cautiously at first, scanning the woods around me. There was no sign of the strange figure, no trace of anything unusual. The cabin looked the same as it had the night before, quiet, serene, untouched. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As the day wore on, I tried to convince myself that it had been a bad dream, that the figure had been some trick of the light or a figment of my imagination. But deep down, I knew it had been real. Whatever it was, it had been out there, and it might still be watching. I spent the rest of the day exploring the woods around the cabin, trying to distract myself from the fear gnawing at the back of my mind. The forest was beautiful, peaceful even, but the unease lingered. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure lurking in the shadows. As evening approached, I reluctantly returned to the cabin. I locked the doors and windows, even though I knew it wouldn't do much to keep whatever had been out there at bay. I didn't want to spend another night in fear, but I didn't have much choice. I tried to settle in, made myself some dinner, and lit a fire in the hearth, but it was hard to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The night passed in silence, the wind howling outside, but nothing came. No scratching at the walls, no thuds, no eerie figures in the shadows. By morning, I was exhausted, but the relief of making it through the night was overwhelming. I packed my things and left the cabin early, not bothering to check out with the owner. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. The place had been beautiful, peaceful, but something about it wasn't right. Maybe it was the isolation, the strange noises, or the figure I had seen. Whatever it was, I knew I wouldn't be coming back. As I drove away, the road seemed less daunting, the trees less oppressive. I still couldn't explain what had happened, but I didn't need to. All I wanted was to get back to civilization, to the noise and the crowds, where things felt normal again. I never told anyone about what I saw. Who would believe me? It was just a weekend in the woods, after all. But every time I close my eyes, I can still see that figure in the shadows, scratching at the walls of the cabin, waiting. And I can't help but wonder, what if it's still out there, waiting for the next person to come through? I was 31 the year I decided to disappear for a while. Not from anything dramatic, not from the law or someone chasing me. I was just tired. I'd worked construction for most of my 20s, long shifts under the sun, dealing with supervisors who barely remembered your name. My knees were giving out and my back felt older than my dad's. So when I got laid off in late spring of 2019, I didn't look for new work right away. I took it as a sign. I had a bit of money saved, not a lot, but enough to float for a few months if I lived cheap. A guy I knew, Rick, used to hunt in northern Wisconsin, and he told me about a place he'd stayed in, an old hunting cabin near Lac View Desert, barely an hour from the Michigan border. He said it was rustic, had no cell service, and nobody went near it after the snow melted because there wasn't much game around. It belonged to a friend of his uncle's or something. He said I could probably rent it for next to nothing if I called the owner directly. So I did. The guy didn't care much. He said if I wanted to give him $400 for the month and not burn it down, the key was under a cement frog by the door. So I packed up my old blue Tacoma with canned food, fishing gear, some tools, and a couple of paperbacks. I didn't bring a laptop. No internet. That was the point. I was going to go off the grid for a while. Just get away from all the noise. I drove up in early June. It took me almost 8 hours from my apartment in Madison. I'd never been that far north before, and the last hour of driving was nothing but trees. The paved roads turned into cracked gravel, and eventually into what felt like trails. I passed a few old houses that looked like no one had lived in them since the 90s. Faded mailboxes with names I couldn't pronounce, old trucks rusting into the earth. The cabin was farther out than I thought. It wasn't even marked. I had to turn off onto a trail that was barely wide enough for my truck. The trees were so close they brushed the sides as I drove in. When I finally got there, it was smaller than I expected. One story, maybe 20 feet wide. It had a screened porch out front and a metal chimney sticking up from the back like a bent finger. The woods around it were thick and alive. The kind of alive that's almost loud. Insects, birds, whined through leaves. I liked it immediately. I found the frog, got the key, and opened the door. The inside smelled like wood smoke and old leather. There was one big room with a stone fireplace, a dusty green couch, a table with 2 chairs, and a kitchen area with a propane stove and a dented fridge that didn't work. A narrow hallway led to a single bedroom and a small bathroom with no mirror and a dry toilet I'd have to empty into a compost bin outside. There was a small window in the bedroom that looked out toward the woods behind the cabin. I set my bags down, cracked a beer, and sat on the porch. The only sounds were birds, the creak of trees, and the distant buzzing of bugs. No cars, no people. It was perfect. The first few days were peaceful. I spent my mornings fishing at a small stream I'd found about a half-mile from the cabin. I'd pack a sandwich, bring a folding chair, and sit by the water for hours. I didn't catch much, but I didn't care. I wasn't there for that. I'd read a lot, took naps, cooked beans and rice on the propane stove. Once or twice, I saw deer in the distance, and one morning I spotted a black bear, just lumbering across the path, not bothering with me. I kept my food sealed tight after that. By the second week, though, things started to shift a little. Not anything big, not at first. Just small details that didn't feel right. The first thing was the footprints. There was a clearing out behind the cabin, maybe 30 feet from the back door. I used it as a spot to dump compost and trash. One morning, I walked out there with a bucket of food scraps, and I saw boot prints in the dirt. Not mine. These were deep, with a square heel and a thick tread. I wore sneakers or sandals every day, nothing that would leave a print like that. And these were fresh, pressed into the damp earth like someone had walked through just that morning. I looked around, called out once, but of course there was no answer. Just trees and brush. That afternoon, I walked the perimeter of the property. There wasn't any fence or anything, but I figured maybe someone had been hiking. It was public land past a certain point. Still, it didn't sit right. I didn't sleep well that night. The next few days were quiet again. I tried to forget about it. Then on Thursday, I went to grab one of my tackle boxes from under the porch, and it was gone. I was sure I'd put it back. I remembered placing it beside the bucket with extra fishing line. Now it was just gone. I thought maybe I'd left it by the stream, but when I walked down there, nothing. I checked all around the cabin. Nothing. I kept my truck locked, but I checked that too. Nothing. Now I started to get that feeling. You know, the one, like someone's been in your space, like the air has changed and doesn't belong to you anymore. That night, I sat up late, reading on the porch with a lantern. I kept listening for sounds, for movement. A few times I thought I heard something, sticks cracking, a low shuffle in the trees, but it could have been anything. Could have been a raccoon, could have been the wind. But the next morning, I found something that made it all feel real. On the window outside the bedroom, on the outside, was a greasy handprint, full-sized, right in the center of the glass, like someone had leaned forward and pressed their palm flat against it. 5 fingers, smudged with dirt or oil. I stood there staring at it for a long time. I hadn't seen or heard a single car since I got there. No visitors, no neighbors, no reason anyone would be out here. It was too far, too hidden. Whoever left that handprint knew I was here. They'd come up close to the cabin. They'd looked inside. That day, I cleaned the rifle I'd brought. I'd only used it once for target practice, but now I loaded it and kept it beside the bed. I didn't sleep well again. Every sound outside made me sit up, heart pounding. 3 days passed. Nothing happened. I didn't go to the stream anymore. I stayed close. I kept the doors locked. I peered out the windows before stepping outside. I told myself maybe it was just a hiker, some random weirdo passing through. But then came the worst night. It started like any other. I ate dinner, just beans and eggs, and sat on the porch until the sun dipped low. The light in the woods went orange, then blue, then gone. I went inside and locked the door. I turned off all the lights and laid in bed with the rifle beside me. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. No loud sound, no dream. Just that sharp, silent kind of waking where your brain tells you something's wrong. The window was open. I never opened that window. It was small, hard to crank, and didn't have a screen. But now it was cracked open an inch, just wide enough to let in cold air. I sat up in bed and stared. The moonlight made the room glow pale blue. My heart thudded like a drum. And then I saw movement. A shape just outside. Not a face, not a clear figure. Just something there, low and hunched. Like someone crouched beside the cabin wall, just beneath the window. Waiting, listening. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just sat frozen, staring at that inch of black space between the window and the frame. I could hear my own breathing, fast and shallow. After what felt like forever, the shape shifted. It stood slowly, like someone pushing up from a crouch. And then it moved away. I didn't hear it walk. I just saw the shadow slide out of view. I didn't sleep. I didn't even blink, I think. I sat up until morning, holding the rifle, eyes locked on that window. When it was finally light, I walked outside. There were more prints in the dirt now. Not just in the clearing, asterisk right asterisk outside the window. Deep and messy. Same boots. And on the side of the cabin, scratched into the wood with something sharp, was a line. Just a single horizontal gouge, as long as my arm, carved low into the wall, like someone had dragged a knife or a key straight across it. That was it for me. I packed that day, shoved everything into the truck as fast as I could. I didn't care about cleaning. I didn't care about the trash. I just needed to get out. I didn't even go back to lock the door. I drove until I hit the main road, then farther until I had bars on my phone again. I pulled over in front of a gas station and just sat there, letting my hands stop shaking. I didn't report it. What could I say? That someone was near my cabin? That I saw a shape in the night? There was no proof, no faces, no names. Just tracks and a handprint. I never went back. Later, I told Rick what happened. He said the owner of the cabin didn't want to hear about it. Said the guy was old, didn't care, probably wouldn't even fix the window. That was 6 years ago. Sometimes I still dream about that window, about the inch of open space and the shape crouched outside. I still lock every door and check every window, even if I'm just going to bed in my apartment. I wanted quiet. I wanted to get away from people. But the thing is, you never really know who's out there. You think It was early October of 2017 when I decided to take some time off from everything. I was 32, living in St. Paul, Minnesota, working in property management, and I'd been getting chewed up by stress for months. Emails, phone calls, complaints. It felt like every hour of my day was claimed by someone else. I needed silence. I needed to hear myself think again. I hadn't slept right in weeks. When I finally burned through the last of my patience and sent a resignation email one Friday night, I packed a few things and got out the next morning. I remembered a small, off-grid cabin that my uncle had owned near Deadfall Ridge in northern Wisconsin. He'd passed away a few years earlier, and no one had touched the place since. I still had the key on an old ring. It wasn't far, maybe a 4-hour drive northeast. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I didn't want anyone knowing. I just needed to vanish for a while, away from lights, noise, everything. I loaded up my Subaru with a cooler, camping stove, canned food, extra water, a first aid kit, some books, and a sleeping bag. I took a small Ruger .22 rifle just for peace of mind, mostly for critters, I figured. The cell signal would be non-existent up there, so I downloaded some offline maps and a GPS backup. The plan was simple. Go up, spend a week in total silence, reset my brain, then come back to the world. The road narrowed the further I went. Asphalt turned to gravel, gravel turned to dirt, and eventually even that gave out. The trail was overgrown, but I remembered just enough to keep going. It was late afternoon when I finally pulled up beside the cabin. The place looked worse than I remembered. Moss was creeping up the sides, and one of the shutters was hanging half off. Still, the roof looked intact, and the door was still locked. Inside, it smelled like dust and dry wood. There were cobwebs in the corners and mouse droppings near the sink, but nothing too wild. The water pump was bone dry, which I expected, and the fireplace had old ash in it. I cracked a few windows and let the air settle. It took a few hours to clean the place up enough to feel livable, but by the time the sun dipped low, I had a small fire going, a can of chili heating on my little stove, and a cot set up in the corner with my sleeping bag. That first night was quiet, dead quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I kept expecting to hear a plane or a car or even some distant dogs barking. But there was nothing, just the occasional wind dragging across the roof or the snap of a twig outside. By the third day, I'd settled into a rhythm. Wake up with the sun, boil some instant coffee, sit on the front steps and listen to the forest. Sometimes I read. Other times I'd just walk a trail for hours, following deer paths and old game trails through the woods. I didn't see anyone. No hunters, no hikers, no campers. Not even a hint of another soul. That suited me fine. On the fourth day, something changed. I woke up feeling stiff and cold. It had dipped below freezing overnight, and I hadn't stoked the fireplace before falling asleep. I pulled on a heavier hoodie and went to start a fire, but I noticed the woodpile looked different. Some of the pieces I'd stacked were moved, just slightly off. I thought maybe an animal had tried to dig around. A raccoon or porcupine, maybe. I brushed it off, got the fire going, and went about my morning. Later that afternoon, I went deeper into the woods than usual. I followed a dry creek I hadn't seen before, and it led to an old hunting blind about 2 miles out. It was just a platform nailed between 2 trees, rotted and leaning. I climbed up out of curiosity and found a rusted coffee can with old cigarette butts inside. I figured it hadn't been used in years. When I got back to the cabin around sunset, I found the front door cracked open. I froze. My heart kicked into overdrive. I was sure I'd locked it. I always did. My hand went straight to the rifle slung over my back. I didn't go inside right away. I stood in the clearing, listening. Nothing moved. The trees swayed a little in the wind, but there was no sound from the cabin. After a few minutes, I crept up, stepped to the side of the door, and nudged it open with the barrel of the rifle. Inside looked normal at first. Nothing obviously missing or trashed. But as I walked in slowly, I saw that the cooler had been opened. 2 cans were gone, one of chili and one of peaches. The bag with my matches was half dumped out. My sleeping bag had fresh dirt on it. I didn't know what to do. I checked around the cabin, but there was no one inside. I looked for tracks around the property, but the ground was hard and covered in dry leaves. Nothing clear. There was no forced entry, just an unlocked door. That night, I barely slept. I kept the rifle beside me, and every sound outside made me sit up and listen. At some point near 3 a.m., I heard what sounded like footsteps outside. Slow, steady crunching in the leaves. I didn't move. I barely breathed. They passed the front porch, circled to the back, then faded. The next morning, I considered leaving, but I told myself maybe it was a drifter or an animal. Someone might have just stumbled onto the place, looking for food or shelter. That happens, right? Still, I packed everything up tight and carried the rifle with me all day, even inside. On day 5, I didn't go far from the cabin. I chopped more wood, boiled extra water, and stayed alert. Around noon, I found a cigarette but near the edge of the clearing. Still fresh, not even wet from the dew. I don't smoke. It hadn't been there before. That's when I knew someone was around. I made the choice to sleep during the day and stay up at night. That night, I sat in the dark with the fire out, wrapped in blankets, rifle in hand, and waited. Around 1:30 a.m., I saw movement near the treeline. Just a shape at first, then 2 people. They were crouched low, maybe 20 yards out, half hidden behind brush. They were watching the cabin. I felt paralyzed. I didn't know what they wanted, if they were armed, if they were just some crazy off-grid types, or worse. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I sat there in total darkness for hours, heart hammering, just watching back. At some point, they vanished. I didn't hear them go, just blinked and they were gone. The next morning, I walked to where they'd been. I found prints, deep ones. 2 people, maybe 3. One wore boots. Another had lighter shoes, maybe sneakers. No gear, no trash, just tracks. I left that afternoon. I didn't pack carefully. I just shoved everything into the back of the Subaru, kept the rifle across my lap, and drove. I didn't stop until I hit a town with cell service. I called the county sheriff's office and gave them the coordinates. I didn't want to go back even with police. They found signs of a camp not far from the cabin. Tarp lean-tos, burned cans, and a few stolen items. They told me it looked like transients. Probably 2 men and maybe a younger person. No names, no arrests. They'd already moved on. I went back to St. Paul. I didn't tell anyone much about it. I sold the cabin to a logger that winter for almost nothing. I've never gone back to the woods since. I still think about those nights. The way they watched from the trees, waiting, not saying anything, just watching. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't some haunted thing. It was real people. And somehow that's a whole lot worse. It was the fall of 1997 when I decided to take a break from the constant noise of the city and the endless stress at work. I was 32, tired, and felt like I needed to disappear for a while. A cabin in the remote woods of northern Vermont seemed perfect. The place was small, almost forgotten, and tucked deep in the forest near a quiet lake named Mirror Lake. It was far from any town, surrounded by towering pine trees that had stood there for centuries. The air smelled of wet earth and pine needles, and I was sure that the silence alone would soothe my nerves. I arrived late afternoon. The sun was starting to dip behind the ridges, casting long shadows that stretched across the dirt road leading to the cabin. The cabin itself was old, built maybe in the 1950s, but sturdy. It had dark brown logs, moss growing on the roof, and a stone chimney that looked like it hadn't seen a fire in years. The porch sagged slightly on one side, and the front door creaked loudly when I pushed it open. Inside, the place smelled of dust and wood smoke. The floorboards were rough and uneven, and the windows were small, with heavy curtains that blocked out most of the fading light. There was a simple kitchen area with an old stove, a tiny sink, and a wooden table that had scratches and burns from years of use. A single bedroom lay at the back, with a bed covered in a faded quilt. I unpacked my bags slowly, feeling the weight of the silence settle over me. No phones worked here, no internet, just me and the woods. The first night passed without incident. The wind whispered outside, and occasionally an owl hooted in the distance. I lit a small fire in the stove to keep warm, but I felt uneasy despite the peaceful setting. I told myself it was the city still clinging to my nerves, that once I was fully away from all the noise, I'd relax. The next day, I spent exploring the woods around the cabin. The trees were tall and thick, the ground covered in fallen leaves that crunched underfoot. I followed a narrow path that led to the lake, where the water was still and dark, reflecting the gray sky. The quiet was almost oppressive, like the forest was holding its breath. I found an old dock, rotted and missing planks, but it jutted out into the lake just enough to sit and look at the water. I sat there for a long time, watching small fish dart near the surface and the occasional ripple from a bird landing far away. As evening came, I gathered firewood for the stove and cooked a simple meal on the old burner. The cabin felt colder than I expected, even with the fire going. I checked the locks on the doors and windows more than once, though I knew it was silly. There was nothing here but trees and silence. That night, something changed. I woke up at around 2 a.m, startled by a strange noise. It was faint at first, a scraping, like something rubbing against the outside of the cabin. I froze, heart pounding, listening closely. The noise stopped after a few seconds, replaced by the sound of the wind again. I told myself it was probably a branch brushing against the wall or maybe an animal. Still, I lay awake for hours, eyes wide, listening to every creak and crack of the old cabin. The next day, I tried to shake off the unease. I kept busy chopping wood, filling the small water jug at the nearby spring, and checking the traps I had set to catch small game for food. The forest felt different now, less welcoming, more watchful. The sunlight seemed weaker, and the shadows under the trees stretched longer. On the third night, the noises came back. This time, it wasn't just scraping. I heard footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. At one point, I thought I heard someone breathing near the door. I stayed perfectly still, pretending to be asleep, but the fear was suffocating. After what felt like hours, the sounds finally stopped. I didn't sleep much after that. I kept the fire going, sitting near the stove with an old hunting knife on the table. The idea that someone was outside, so close, made my skin crawl. I thought about leaving, but I had driven hours to get here, and part of me wanted to face whatever this was. The next morning, I went outside to check around the cabin. The ground near the back door was disturbed, like someone had been standing there for a while. There were footprints, barefoot, small, maybe a kid or a woman. I didn't see anyone in the forest, but the prints were fresh. I decided I couldn't just sit and wait. I packed a small bag with essentials, water, knife, flashlight, and followed the footprints into the woods. The path was faint, and the forest thickened as I went deeper. I was nervous but determined to find whoever was here. After walking for about an hour, I came across an abandoned campsite. It looked recent. There was a fire pit with cold ashes, a torn tarp hanging between 2 trees, and some empty cans scattered around. Nearby, I found a makeshift bed of leaves and pine needles. It was clear someone had been living here for a while. I didn't stay long. Something about the place felt wrong. The silence around the campsite was too complete, like the forest was holding its breath again. I hurried back to the cabin, glancing over my shoulder the entire way. That night, I barely slept. I stayed awake by the fire, watching the windows, listening to every sound. Around midnight, the footsteps came again. This time, they were louder, more confident. I heard the scraping noise again, but closer, right outside the front door. I grabbed my knife and flashlight, heart racing. I switched on the light and shone it out the window. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow move near the porch. I backed away slowly, keeping the light on the door. Suddenly, the door handle rattled. Someone was trying to get in. I shouted and slammed the window shut. The door rattled harder. I could hear breathing now, heavy and uneven. I grabbed a heavy cast iron pan from the kitchen and waited, ready to defend myself. After a few minutes, the noises stopped. I waited longer, but no one came back. The next morning, I found muddy footprints circling the cabin, some leading into the woods, others disappearing near the lake. The feeling of being watched never left me. For the next 2 days, I stayed inside, keeping the fire going and watching every shadow. I avoided going outside after dark and only left the cabin in the daytime to gather supplies. The fear had settled into my bones. On the 5th day, I was ready to leave. I packed quickly, making sure I had everything. Before I got in my car, I checked the cabin one last time. That's when I saw it. Deep scratches on the front door, long and jagged, like claws. The wood was splintered, and some of the scratches looked fresh. My heart sank. Whoever or whatever had been here wasn't going to let me go so easily. I got in the car and drove away, not stopping until the trees gave way to the open road and signs of civilization. I didn't look back. Later, I learned from the locals that the area was known for occasional squatters. People escaping their lives, hiding in the woods. Some were harmless, but others were desperate and dangerous. The authorities rarely patrolled that far out. I never went back. The cabin still stands there, somewhere near Mirror Lake, silent and waiting. I sometimes wonder who or what I really encountered those nights. But I'm sure of one thing. The forest is full of secrets, and some of them want to stay hidden. The winter of 1998 was one of the coldest I ever experienced. I was 27 at the time, restless and in need of solitude. I had spent months working long hours in a small factory in rural Montana, the job dull and the days blending into one another. I decided to take a week off and retreat to a cabin I'd rented deep in the Bitterroot Mountains, far from any roads or towns. I wanted nothing but silence, the cold biting air, and a chance to clear my head. The cabin itself was modest, built in the early 70s by a man who once worked as a logger. It sat on a small clearing surrounded by towering pine and fir trees, nestled at the base of a ridge. The only access was a narrow, unplowed forest road that twisted and turned for nearly 10 miles from the nearest highway. By the time I arrived, snow was falling thickly, covering the ground in a white blanket. The sky was heavy and gray, promising more cold to come. I parked my old pickup truck near the small wooden porch and unloaded my gear. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine sap and damp wood. A small wood stove sat in the corner of the main room, its black iron surface cold to the touch. There was a cot pushed against the wall, a rickety table, and a small kitchen area with a rusty sink and a propane burner. A bookshelf held a few faded paperbacks and an old manual for operating the stove. A single window faced the woods, frost creeping around the edges. That first night, after chopping and stacking enough firewood to last me a few days, I lit the stove and settled in with a mug of hot tea. Outside, the wind moaned through the trees, and the snow thickened, muffling all sound. I felt a strange comfort in the isolation, even though the cold seemed to press in against the walls like an invisible weight. The next morning, I woke early to a sky full of pale sunlight reflecting off the snow. I bundled up in layers of wool and flannel and stepped outside. The silence was absolute except for the faint crackle of my boots crunching over the frozen ground. I had brought supplies to last the week: canned food, jerky, instant coffee, and a small radio with batteries. The radio barely picked up anything beyond static and a distant, faint broadcast from a station miles away. For the first few days, I kept to a routine: chop wood, feed the stove, gather water from a nearby stream that was mostly frozen over, and wander around the clearing and the forest edge, taking photos and notes. I wanted to capture the quiet beauty of the place, but as time went on, I realized how deep the silence was, how the woods seemed to swallow sound completely. No birds sang, no animals stirred, at least not visibly. On the 3rd day, a storm moved in. Snow fell thick and fast, covering my tracks and making the road nearly invisible. The wind whipped through the trees, bending their branches in sharp arcs. I was grateful for the cabin's shelter and spent most of the day inside, reading the old books and watching the fire crackle in the stove. That night, I noticed something strange. The cabin seemed to groan and creak more than usual, as if the cold was making the wood shrink and shift. I didn't think much of it until I heard a distinct tapping sound coming from outside the window. It was faint but rhythmic, like something knocking on the glass. I looked out but saw nothing in the deep dark forest. The tapping stopped after a few minutes, and I told myself it was probably the wind or a branch hitting the window. But it left me unsettled. The next morning, after a restless night, I decided to check the perimeter of the cabin. The snow had stopped falling, and the sun was weak but visible behind heavy clouds. Walking around, I noticed the snow was disturbed in a strange pattern. Tracks leading around the cabin, but they weren't animal prints. They were too large and irregular. Something had circled the cabin overnight. I followed the tracks cautiously. They disappeared into the thick woods, heading downhill towards a frozen creek. There were no other marks beyond that. My heart pounded, but I tried to calm myself. Maybe some hunter or woodsman had passed by, checking the cabin. It was possible. Still, the tracks didn't match any boots I had seen, and I was the only renter for miles. That afternoon, I spent time trying to repair the small propane heater. It was old and unreliable, and with the stove running low on wood, I needed another heat source. While working near the door, I found a small bundle tucked into the snow, wrapped in a plastic bag. Inside were a few scraps of paper, wet and torn, but legible enough to read a few words. Help, lost, don't trust. The handwriting was shaky, hurried. I froze, staring at the papers. Who had left them? How had they gotten here? Was someone in trouble? I stuffed the papers into my coat pocket, feeling a cold knot of fear tightening in my stomach. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, every crack of a branch outside felt like a warning. I kept the small hunting knife I'd packed close, and the old flashlight was switched on beside me. Around midnight, the tapping returned, louder this time. Not on the window, but on the door. Slow, deliberate knocks 3 times, then a pause, then 3 more. I didn't move. The air grew colder, and I felt the blood drain from my face. I reached for my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. No matter how many times I tried, the screen stayed blank. The knocking stopped as suddenly as it began. After an hour of tense silence, I forced myself to sleep. The next morning, snow had piled up against the door, making it nearly impossible to open. When I finally managed to shove it aside, I noticed fresh footprints leading away from the cabin into the forest. They were too big for any animal. They looked human. I grabbed my camera and followed the tracks, moving carefully and quietly. They led downhill, deeper into the woods, toward a narrow ravine where the creek rushed beneath an icy bridge. The footprints ended there. At the edge of the ravine, I saw a small campfire ring made of stones. The ashes were cold, but not old. Nearby, half buried in the snow, was a torn piece of cloth, a fragment of a jacket, dark green. I didn't know what to think. Someone had been here recently, close enough to the cabin to watch me, maybe even approach. That day, the weather worsened. Snow fell steadily, the wind gusting like a living thing, howling through the trees. The temperature dropped below 0. I stayed inside, pacing the cabin, checking the windows and doors constantly. By evening, the stove was nearly out of fuel. The propane tank was empty. I was running low on food and water. I needed to leave. I prepared my pack, taking only the essentials. A small first aid kit, extra clothes, my knife, flashlight, camera, and the scraps of paper I had found. I knew I couldn't wait for help that wasn't coming. At first light the next day, I set out on foot down the forest road, hoping to reach the highway before nightfall. The snow was deep, and the cold cut through my layers like a blade. My boots were soaked, my hands numb. Hours passed. I kept looking back, half expecting to see someone following me. I never did. As the day went on, the sky darkened again, heavy with snow clouds. I pushed on, slipping and stumbling, the forest silent but for the crunch of my boots. By mid-afternoon, I spotted a faint glow in the distance, the faint lights of a highway. Relief washed over me. I increased my pace, but then I heard it, a distant howl, low and guttural. Not quite a wolf, but close. It echoed through the trees, chilling me to the bone. I broke into a run, desperate now. Suddenly, from the thick woods to my right, a figure stepped out. Tall, wearing a heavy coat, face obscured by shadows. My heart slammed against my ribs. I froze. The figure didn't move toward me, just watched. I swallowed hard and kept moving, trying not to look back. The howl came again, closer now. I reached the highway just as the first snowflakes of the new storm began to fall. Cars passed by, lights shining brightly. I flagged one down, breathless and shaking. The driver stopped and helped me get into the warm car. As I sat there, safe at last, I looked down at the torn scraps of paper in my hand. The words still haunted me. I never saw the figure again. I never found out who left the notes or why they circled the cabin. But I knew one thing for sure. Some dangers out in those woods are not about ghosts or fairy tales. They are real, and sometimes survival means just getting away. I spent years planning a trip like this. Just me, a cabin in the woods, and a chance to escape everything for a week. No phone, no internet, no noise except the wind and the trees. It was late October 1998 when I finally made it out to the remote cabin tucked deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. I was 29 years old then, working a job that burned me out every day, craving silence and time to breathe. The cabin was owned by a family friend who hadn't used it for a few years, and he agreed to let me stay while he was away. I'd never been so far off the grid before. The drive itself was long and winding. I left the main highway just before dusk and took the last dirt road turnoff, a narrow path covered in fallen leaves. The trees here were old and thick, their branches bare and twisting against the gray sky. When I arrived, the cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded by tall pines and oaks, their trunks blackened by years of storms. The place looked older than I expected, weathered with siding with peeling paint, a stone chimney with moss growing between the cracks, and a rusty metal roof. No other cabins in sight, just forest stretching out on every side. I parked my old Chevy pickup on a patch of grass that was half muddy from recent rain. The air was cold, with a sharp bite that hinted winter was coming soon. I took my pack, grabbed the keys from the glove box, and crossed the small porch that creaked under my weight. The door opened with a deep groan and a faint smell of dust and old wood hit me. Inside, the cabin was dim but cozy. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a metal grate and some old logs stacked nearby. The floor was rough pine, worn smooth by years of use. A small kitchen nook sat off to one side, complete with a rusty old stove and a wooden table. There was a single bedroom in the back, with a narrow bed and threadbare blankets. I'd brought a few supplies: canned food, bottled water, a small propane stove, some matches, and a lantern. No electricity here. The cabin had a woodpile outside, so I set about chopping some kindling to build a fire. The dry wood smelled faintly of pine resin, and the crackling flames quickly warmed the room. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a blood-red glow over the treetops. That first night, the silence felt strange and heavy. No distant cars, no neighbors shouting, no hum of city lights. Just me and the sound of the wind brushing through the branches. Every now and then, a sharp snap of a twig broke the quiet. I thought maybe a deer or raccoon nearby, but my imagination started to trick me. Shadows in the corners of the room seemed to flicker and dance, the flames throwing uneven light against the walls. I lay on the bed with a thick wool blanket pulled tight, feeling the cold seep through the wooden floorboards. Around midnight, I heard it, a faint rustling sound just beyond the cabin, like something moving through the underbrush. I froze, heart hammering. The sound came again, slow and deliberate, as if whatever was out there was pacing just outside the clearing. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door carefully, stepping onto the porch. The air was still cold and sharp. I shined the beam into the darkness but saw nothing except the outline of trees. No eyes, no movement, just silence. The sound stopped. Maybe it was a coyote or some other wild animal passing by. I closed the door and tried to calm down. The next day, I spent exploring the area around the cabin. The forest was thick with fallen leaves, broken branches, and patches of wet moss. The ground was soft from recent rains. I followed a faint trail that led downhill toward a small creek. The water was clear and icy cold, trickling over smooth stones. I filled my canteen and sat on a rock for a while, watching as the water flowed. I found a few spots with old hunting traps and footprints, maybe from bears or deer. The forest felt alive but empty, like I was the only person around for miles. Back at the cabin, I gathered more firewood and started cleaning up. I wiped the dust from the table, swept the floor, and checked the windows for cracks. The sun was warm through the glass, but the shadows grew long fast. The evening came quietly. I built the fire again and cooked some canned beans, feeling the peaceful rhythm of simple tasks. On the third night, something changed. I woke just before dawn to a strange noise. It wasn't the wind or animals. It was a deep, dragging sound, like heavy feet moving slowly through the leaves, coming closer. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. The sound stopped right outside the cabin. Then soft thumps against the wooden wall, like something hitting the siding, slowly, methodically. I grabbed my old hunting knife from my pack and crept to the window. Through the frost-speckled glass, I saw nothing but shadows. The thumping continued, maybe for a minute, then stopped abruptly. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I kept the fire going and sat in the corner, watching the door. As the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I stepped outside with my flashlight to check the perimeter. There were no footprints near the cabin, no signs of any animal or person, just the usual fallen leaves and broken twigs. But something was wrong. I could feel it. The air felt heavier, like the woods were watching me. I decided to stay inside most of the next day. I rationed my food carefully, kept the fire burning, and didn't stray far. I started to notice small things: scratches on the wooden doorframe, marks on the porch steps that hadn't been there before. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. When the sun went down, I locked the door and piled logs against it. The night was long and restless. Every crack, every snap of a twig outside made me jump. I tried to tell myself it was just the forest, but the fear settled deep inside. By the fifth day, my nerves were stretched thin. I was running low on food and water and felt exhausted. I thought about packing up early, but the nearest town was hours away by car, and the dirt roads were rough. My phone had no signal out here anyway. I decided to wait for morning before leaving. That night, the noises started again. First, the dragging sound, slow and deliberate. Then soft thumps on the walls, this time louder and more frequent. I pressed my back against the door, knife in hand, listening to the quiet, broken only by those sounds. After what felt like hours, the noise stopped. I sat frozen until dawn, feeling the weight of every second. In the morning, I forced myself outside to inspect the damage. The doorframe had deep gouges, and the porch steps had fresh claw marks. I searched the clearing for signs of whatever had come so close but found only broken branches and flattened leaves. It was impossible to tell if it was an animal or a person. The thought that someone could have been watching me all week sent a chill down my spine. I packed quickly, loading my gear into the truck. I kept the engine running, eyes scanning the edge of the woods as I prepared to leave. I glanced in the rearview mirror once more before pulling onto the dirt road, heart still racing. The forest behind me seemed to watch silently as I drove away. That trip taught me how small and vulnerable a person can be in the wild. No stories or myths, just raw fear and the unknown. The cabin wasn't haunted by ghosts, but by something real and unseen. I never went back, and I never forgot the cold weight of being watched in a silent forest, alone with nothing but my own fear to keep me company. It was late October in 2009 when I decided to take a solo trip to a cabin deep in the woods of northern Vermont. I was 28 at the time, working as a graphic designer in Boston, and I'd been feeling overwhelmed by the constant noise and crowds of the city. The idea was simple: spend a week alone in the woods, away from people, phones, and the internet. I wanted silence, calm, and some space to think. Nothing fancy, just me, a small cabin, and the forest. The cabin was old but sturdy, sitting on a little clearing surrounded by tall pines and maples, their leaves turning red and gold. I drove for about 3 hours from Boston, leaving the highway behind and following narrow, winding country roads until the pavement gave way to gravel. The final stretch was a bumpy dirt path that ran alongside a frozen creek. It was quiet, colder than I expected for early fall, and the air smelled like pine needles and damp earth. When I arrived, the sun was low and fading fast behind the trees. The cabin looked small and worn but cozy, built from rough timber with a stone chimney that had long since gone cold. It had one big room inside with a wood stove, a tiny kitchen corner, and a fold-out bed shoved into the back. There was no electricity, no running water, just a small solar panel on the roof to power a couple of lights and my phone charger, though I planned to mostly keep the phone off. I set my stuff down, lit the wood stove, and made myself a simple dinner of canned beans heated over the stove. The silence wrapped around me like a thick blanket, strange but peaceful. Outside, the woods were almost black, but I could hear the soft rustling of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig, and the distant hoot of an owl. The first couple of days went by quietly. I explored the trails, collected firewood, and read a worn paperback I'd brought along. During the day, the forest felt alive and comforting, with shafts of sunlight filtering through the branches and squirrels chasing each other through the underbrush. At night, I'd sit by the stove, watching the fire crackle and writing in my journal by flashlight. On the third night, something changed. I was lying in the bed, the thin mattress creaking as I shifted, when I heard a noise outside, a faint, irregular tapping, like someone knocking lightly on wood or branches. It wasn't loud, and it didn't sound like an animal. It was rhythmic but uneven, almost deliberate. I froze and listened, heart pounding. I told myself it was just the wind or maybe a small animal brushing against the cabin. But the noise came back a few minutes later, this time closer, as if whoever or whatever was making it was near the door. I pulled the blanket tighter, pretending to ignore it. The next morning, I walked around the cabin looking for signs of who or what had been outside. The ground was damp from recent rain, and I spotted a few strange footprints in the mud near the front door. They were large, human-shaped, but muddied and unclear, like someone had been walking slowly around the cabin in the dark. I felt uneasy but didn't want to jump to conclusions. I checked my phone for signal, none. I was completely off the grid. That day, I found myself glancing nervously at the trees whenever a breeze moved the branches or a bird flew overhead. The woods suddenly felt less friendly, more watchful. At night, the tapping noise returned several times, always faint, always coming from different spots around the cabin. I stopped leaving the door unlocked and kept the small axe I'd brought close by. By the 5th day, my nerves were fraying. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I was tired, alone, and the isolation was messing with my head. But then, in the afternoon, something happened that made me realize I wasn't just being paranoid. I was walking along the creek a few hundred feet from the cabin, looking for firewood, when I noticed broken branches and crushed leaves scattered along the path. It looked like someone had been moving through the woods, not just passing by but lingering. I followed the trail carefully, trying to stay quiet. Suddenly, about 50 yards ahead, I caught sight of a man. He was tall and thin, wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap pulled low. He was crouched down near the creek bank, his back to me, fiddling with something in the water. I couldn't tell what, but I didn't want to get closer. I swallowed hard and took a step back, trying to stay out of sight. But he turned his head quickly, as if he sensed me, and for a moment our eyes met. His face was pale and serious, with a look that chilled me deeper than the cold air. I didn't stay to find out what he wanted. I turned and ran back to the cabin as fast as I could, adrenaline pumping. Once inside, I locked every door and window, grabbed my phone, and tried to call for help. No signal. That night, I stayed awake by the fire, the axe within reach. The tapping noises returned but louder, more forceful, like someone knocking to get inside. I didn't dare open the door or look outside for long. I could hear footsteps circling the cabin, crunching on the leaves and twigs, stopping sometimes, then moving again. Sleep didn't come. I sat there, feeling trapped and watched. The next morning, I found something disturbing. Deep scratches on the wooden front door, as if someone had tried to claw or pry it open during the night. The lock was damaged, bent slightly but still holding. My heart sank. I debated packing up and leaving right then, but the dirt road I'd come in on was muddy and looked recently disturbed, like someone had been driving down it or maybe blocking it. I wasn't sure if I'd be able to get out without encountering whoever was watching me. Over the next 2 days, I stayed mostly inside, barely venturing out except to get water from the creek, always checking over my shoulder. I set up makeshift alarms outside, a few cans tied with string that would clang if disturbed. The tapping never stopped. Sometimes I caught glimpses of a figure in the trees, always keeping distance but watching. On the 6th night, the tension broke. Around midnight, the tapping turned into heavy pounding. The door shook violently as someone tried to force it open. I grabbed the axe, ready to defend myself. The noise was terrifying. Harsh thuds, scraping, something heavy being thrown against the cabin. Then silence. I waited, frozen. After what felt like an eternity, I heard footsteps retreating into the woods. I didn't dare move for the rest of the night. At dawn, I finally summoned the courage to check outside. The door was battered, splinters scattered around the threshold. Footprints surrounded the cabin. More than one set, large and heavy, pressed into the soft earth. The cans I'd hung had been knocked to the ground. I gathered what little I could carry and prepared to leave. The road was clear enough, and though I was scared, I knew staying longer wasn't safe. As I drove away, heart pounding, I realized the real terror wasn't ghosts or monsters, but the very real fear of someone watching and wanting to get inside. The woods were no longer peaceful but threatening, a place where being alone made you vulnerable. Back in Boston, I told no one the full story, afraid it would sound crazy. The cabin trip was supposed to be a peaceful escape, but it ended as a test of my will to survive against something unknown but very real. Looking back, I understand now that the isolation can mess with your mind, but it can also reveal dangers you never expect. The silence hides more than just nature. It can hide people too, people who don't want you there. I never went back to that cabin. I sold it years later after I finally tracked down the owner, and I never told anyone else to go there alone. Sometimes I still wonder who that man was, what he wanted, and why he chose that remote place to haunt. But one thing is clear. In the woods, no one is truly alone, and some quiet places hold dark secrets that have nothing to do with ghosts. It was the fall of 1998 when I decided to take a solo trip to a small cabin in the woods of northern Maine. I was 27 then, working a stressful job in the city, and wanted to get away from all the noise and people for a while. I found the cabin through a local listing, an old rental owned by a family that lived nearby. It wasn't fancy, just a simple wooden structure with a stone chimney, built sometime in the 1950s. The place sat on the edge of a dense forest, about a mile from the closest dirt road. The nearest town was a small village called Ashfield, a quiet place with just a few stores and a gas station. I arrived in the early afternoon, carrying my backpack and a small cooler with some food. The sun was bright but cold, the kind of sharp chill you feel in the air when fall is turning into winter. The trees were heavy with red, orange, and yellow leaves, and the ground was soft with fallen leaves. The smell of pine and damp earth filled the air. When I opened the cabin door, I was greeted by a musty smell mixed with old wood and something faintly like mildew. The cabin had a small living area with a worn-out couch, a wooden table, and a cast iron stove in the corner. The kitchen was tiny, with old cabinets and a small sink, but there was a cold water tap that worked. Upstairs, there was a loft with a single bed, a dresser, and a small window that looked out over the trees. I set down my stuff and took a deep breath. The silence was so thick it felt almost heavy. No cars, no voices, just the occasional bird or squirrel. I had planned this trip for months, craving this kind of peace. I spent the first hour unpacking, stacking firewood near the stove, and preparing some soup on the stove. The crackling of the fire was comforting. Outside, the wind started to pick up as the sun dipped lower, rustling the leaves in the trees. I watched the shadows stretch across the cabin floor, feeling a little shiver run down my spine. Not from cold, but from the stillness of it all. That first night passed without anything unusual. I went to bed early, wrapped in a thick blanket. The sounds of the forest at night were strange but not frightening, just the normal noises of nature. I slept well, waking early to the gray light of dawn filtering through the small window. I made coffee on the stove, ate some toast, and planned to hike around the woods a bit before settling in for a few days of reading and relaxing. The next morning, as I stepped outside, the air was damp and cool. The ground was covered in a thin layer of frost. I walked down a faint trail that led from the cabin into the trees, a path barely wide enough for one person. The forest was dense and quiet. I saw deer tracks in the mud, and birds flitted overhead. The forest floor was thick with moss and fallen leaves. The deeper I went, the darker it felt, even in the daytime. The trees were tall and close together, blocking much of the sky. I noticed that some of the trees looked older, with thick trunks scarred by time and weather. Occasionally, I found piles of broken branches or stumps where trees had been cut or fallen. The smell of wet wood and earth was strong. I kept a small pocket knife in my jacket and a flashlight in my backpack. I told myself it was just precaution, though there was no reason to feel uneasy. By mid-afternoon, I found a small clearing with a shallow pond. The water was still and dark, reflecting the gray sky above. I sat on a fallen log and took out a notebook, writing down thoughts and sketches of the area. It was peaceful, almost beautiful, and I felt glad I had come. But as the day wore on, I began to notice something odd. The trail I had followed didn't look as clear on my way back. Branches and leaves seemed to have been disturbed, and I caught glimpses of broken twigs or bent grass. At first, I thought it was just animals moving around, but the marks looked like footsteps, human footsteps, too large and heavy to belong to deer or other wildlife. My heart rate quickened, but I told myself I was imagining things. Back at the cabin, I checked the windows and doors, making sure they were locked. The feeling of being watched crept in, subtle at first, then stronger. The cabin felt smaller and less cozy. I stacked more firewood and prepared a simple dinner of canned beans and rice. The wind howled outside, and I could hear the branches scraping against the cabin walls. That night, sleep was difficult. Every creak and groan of the old wood made me tense. I kept thinking about those footsteps. The forest was supposed to be empty, especially at night. Why would anyone be out here? The nearest town was miles away, and this cabin was off the grid. I tried to calm myself, telling myself there was a logical explanation. Maybe hunters or hikers, but something didn't sit right. Around midnight, I woke to a sound outside, a soft rustling, like leaves being pushed or moved. I stayed still, heart pounding, eyes fixed on the window. The moon was full and bright, casting silvery light over the trees. For a long time, I saw nothing. Then, at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the porch light's glow, I saw a dark shape moving slowly between the trees. It was tall, maybe a man, but I couldn't make out details. I debated what to do. I had no cell service here. The nearest phone was in Ashfield, miles away. I grabbed a heavy flashlight and my pocket knife, ready to defend myself if needed. I sat by the door, watching the shadow move closer, then stop, then disappear behind a tree. The night passed with no further incident, but the feeling of danger stayed with me. The next morning, I thought about leaving early. I packed my things, but something inside me pushed me to stay a little longer, to understand what was going on. On the third day, I decided to explore the area around the cabin more carefully. I wanted to find any signs of other people or animals, anything to explain the footsteps and the shadow I'd seen. I brought my backpack with food, water, and some basic survival gear. As I walked deeper into the forest, the trees grew closer, and the air became cooler and damper. The trail faded completely, replaced by tangled roots and thick underbrush. I had to push branches aside and step carefully over fallen logs. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the crunch of my boots on dry leaves and occasional bird calls. After about an hour, I spotted something strange ahead. A small pile of objects arranged neatly on the forest floor. It looked like someone had placed sticks, leaves, and stones in a circle around what appeared to be a broken old camera and some scraps of torn cloth. I crouched down, examining the items closely. The camera was ancient, like from the 1960s or 70s, and the cloth was faded but smelled like damp fabric. I took a deep breath and looked around. No signs of people nearby, no recent footprints. The forest felt empty and still again, but this time the weight was different. There was an eerie sense of someone having been there long ago, maybe living or hiding, and then suddenly gone. I kept walking, the sun shifting behind clouds, making the light dimmer. I found more signs of an old campsite, a rusted canteen, a tattered blanket, and some empty cans buried under leaves. It looked like someone had been living rough here a long time ago, forgotten by the world. On the way back, I decided to take a different path, heading toward a small ridge that overlooked the cabin and the surrounding forest. From there, I could see the tops of trees stretching in all directions, a vast green sea broken only by the narrow dirt road far off to the east. That evening, back at the cabin, I felt the loneliness settle in deeply. The silence pressed in on me. I tried to keep busy by cleaning the cabin and reading some old magazines left behind. But my mind kept returning to the shadow and the old campsite. On the fourth day, something happened that changed everything. It started in the morning when I stepped outside to collect firewood. Near the cabin porch, I found fresh footprints in the dirt, large, heavy, and unmistakably human. They led into the forest and then disappeared between the trees. My heart sank. Someone had been at the cabin while I was inside, maybe watching or waiting. I checked the doors and windows. All were still locked from the inside, no signs of forced entry. Whoever had been here was careful, quiet. I felt exposed, vulnerable. I spent the day preparing for the worst. I collected as much firewood as possible, doubled the locks on the doors with some nails and screws from a toolbox I found in the cabin, and created a makeshift alarm by stringing some empty cans around the porch that would rattle if touched. As night fell, I kept a fire burning in the stove, its warmth a small comfort against the growing chill outside. The wind had picked up again, and the trees shook violently, their branches scratching the cabin walls. Around midnight, the sound came again. Soft rustling outside, faint footsteps around the cabin, and the clatter of the cans I had set up. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The noise stopped after a few minutes, and silence returned. The next morning, I found one of the cans knocked off the string and lying on the porch, dented. Whoever had been here was testing me, letting me know they could get close. Fear gripped me. I debated whether to leave immediately. It was the autumn of 1997 when I decided to take a break from the city, from work, from everything that was steadily draining me. At 29, I felt the weight of the years bearing down. The endless cycle of deadlines, the never-ending noise of traffic, the flickering lights of screens from dawn till dusk. I needed to breathe air that wasn't recycled or tainted by gasoline fumes. So, I rented a small cabin deep in the woods of northern Vermont, miles from the nearest town, a place with no cell phone service, no internet, and barely any visitors. The cabin was modest, built in the early 70s from weathered pine logs, nestled on the edge of a dense forest. It sat near the edge of a small lake, a few hundred yards from the water's edge. The dirt road to get there was rough and winding, barely wide enough for one car, with trees arching overhead like a tunnel of leaves and branches. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, a sharp contrast to the stale city smell I'd left behind. I arrived just before dusk, with my old Jeep loaded with supplies. Canned food, water jugs, a lantern, blankets, a first aid kit, and a few books. The owner of the cabin had warned me that the place was off the grid. No electricity, just a small wood stove for heat and cooking. Perfect for what I wanted, isolation. The front porch was creaky but solid, and the windows were small but clean. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the wooden floor cold beneath my boots. The air inside smelled faintly of old wood and something else I couldn't place. A hint of dampness, maybe, or a leftover trace of smoke from the last occupants. The cabin was simple inside. There was a small kitchen area with a sink, no running water, but a well outside that I'd have to pump, a tiny table, and a couple of chairs. The main room had a wood stove, a few shelves filled with dusty books and kitchenware, and a couch with a blanket thrown over it. Upstairs, a loft held a mattress with threadbare sheets. I dropped my bags and went outside to pump water. The pump creaked and groaned but finally yielded cool, clear water. I filled my bottles and took a deep breath, feeling the chill of the evening air settle into my bones. That night, after stacking some wood for the stove, I lit a fire inside, watching the flames flicker and cast dancing shadows on the walls. The cabin creaked as it settled with the temperature change outside. The wind rustled the trees, and somewhere in the distance, I heard the faint call of an owl. I had no reason to be afraid. The forest was just forest. But even so, the stillness felt thick, like a weight pressing down on the silence. I fell asleep quickly, the fire crackling softly beside me. The next few days were a strange kind of peace. I spent the mornings walking around the lake, watching the leaves fall and listening to the occasional splash of a fish breaking the water's surface. The afternoons were for reading and cooking simple meals on the stove. Canned beans, rice, dried meat. No distractions, just the slow passage of time marked by the sun's movement and the changing colors of the forest. At night, I'd sit by the fire, sometimes writing notes in a journal I'd brought, sometimes just staring into the flames. On the third day, something shifted. I was outside chopping wood when I noticed fresh tire tracks on the dirt road, partially covered by leaves but still visible. They were recent, the mud was soft from last night's rain, and the tread was sharp. Whoever had driven there had come after me. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, but I told myself it was probably just someone else renting a nearby cabin, maybe coming to check the area. Still, the isolation that had felt like freedom now started to feel more like vulnerability. That evening, the wind picked up stronger than before. The trees groaned and bent, and the cabin rattled in its frame. I kept the fire burning, but the sound of branches scraping the windows was enough to keep me on edge. Then I heard it, a faint knocking on the door. I froze, heart pounding. The knocking came again, slow and deliberate. I didn't open. Instead, I grabbed my flashlight and peered through the small window next to the door. The porch was empty, no sign of anyone. The woods were dark, the trees swaying wildly in the wind. I checked the perimeter of the cabin, flashlight in hand, but found no footprints, no signs of a person nearby. The knocking never came again that night, but the unease stayed with me. I kept the doors locked and the fire burning until I finally fell asleep, the shadows on the walls turning into shapes I couldn't quite see. The next morning, I woke to a clear sky but a strange silence. No birds singing, no insects buzzing, just the wind gently shaking the leaves. As I stepped outside, I noticed something odd. The front porch had fresh scratches on the wood, deep gouges as if someone or something had clawed at the surface. The wood stove inside was cold, but there were ashes from last night's fire. It hadn't been used recently, or at least not by me that morning. I searched the area around the cabin, trying to find any clue. There were no footprints, no signs of an animal, just the quiet forest, endless and watchful. The feeling of being watched crawled up my spine. That afternoon, I decided to explore farther into the woods, hoping to shake off the tension. I took my old compass and a small map, walking along a narrow deer trail. The forest was dense, the trees towering and thick with moss. The sunlight barely pierced through the canopy, casting everything in a muted greenish light. Birds flew overhead, and every so often, I caught the rustle of a squirrel or rabbit darting through the underbrush. About 2 miles in, I found something unexpected, an abandoned campsite. There was a fire pit filled with cold ashes, a few empty cans, and a torn tent frame that had clearly been left behind in a hurry. Nearby, a shallow hole was dug, partially covered by leaves and sticks. I knelt and examined the spot. It looked like someone had buried something here, but I couldn't tell what. The air suddenly felt colder. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone watching me, but there was no one. I packed up and hurried back to the cabin, the forest suddenly feeling bigger, darker, and less welcoming. That night, I barely slept. I kept waking at odd intervals, heart racing. I thought I heard footsteps crunching on the leaves outside, but when I looked out the window, there was nothing but shadows. On the fourth day, I found a broken section of the fence that surrounded the cabin property. The wire was cut cleanly, like with a knife, and the posts were disturbed. I realized someone had been coming close, maybe even sneaking around while I was inside. I started locking the windows and barricading the door with a heavy chair. The peaceful retreat I had imagined was gone. Now I was watching and waiting. The tension gnawed at me during the daylight hours, but night was worse. The woods around the cabin seemed to breathe and shift, filled with unseen things moving just beyond my sight. I heard rustling, snapping twigs, sometimes the faint sound of voices, low murmurs carried by the wind. I told myself it was my imagination or the natural sounds of the forest, but it was impossible to ignore. One evening, as I was stacking firewood outside, I caught a glimpse of something in the trees, a figure standing just beyond the edge of the clearing. It was tall, wearing dark clothes that blended perfectly with the shadows. I froze, unable to move or call out. The figure stood still for a long moment, then slipped away silently. I didn't sleep at all that night. The cabin felt smaller, like the walls were closing in, and every sound was amplified. The creaks of the floor, the whistle of the wind, the distant howls of a coyote. I sat by the fire with a baseball bat I found in the corner, trying to calm my nerves. The next morning, I decided to leave. I packed up quickly, stuffing everything into my bags. As I locked the cabin door behind me, I glanced back and noticed something chilling: fresh footprints around the porch. They were large, heavy, and led off into the forest, away from the road. I didn't stop to look further. I ran to the Jeep, my heart pounding, hands shaking as I started the engine. The dirt road was slippery from recent rain, and I had to be careful driving, but I didn't slow down. As I drove away, the forest seemed to close behind me, swallowing the cabin and the small clearing. It was only when I reached the main highway that I allowed myself to breathe. The noise of cars, the lights, the presence of other people was overwhelming after so many days alone. I pulled over and called the owner of the cabin, telling her I was leaving early, that something had made me uncomfortable. She listened and then told me something I hadn't known. A man had been reported missing in that area a few weeks before I arrived. They searched the woods, but no trace was ever found. Some said he was a hunter, others thought he might have gotten lost. The police never found anything. I never went back. Looking back, I realized that the isolation had left me vulnerable in ways I hadn't expected. The forest wasn't haunted by ghosts or monsters, but by people, or perhaps just one person, who did. I had been looking forward to this weekend for months. After a brutal winter in 1998, stuck in my cramped apartment in Vermont, I needed to get away. My name is Daniel Harper. I was 28 years old at the time and work as a graphic designer in Boston. Stress had been piling up for weeks. Tight deadlines, city noise, and just the constant buzz of people everywhere. So I decided to rent a small cabin deep in the woods of the Green Mountains for some peace and quiet. No phone, no internet, just me, the trees, and fresh air. The cabin was about a 2-hour drive from my apartment, down winding roads lined with thick pine trees and occasional patches of melting snow. The location was remote, off the beaten path, near a little lake called Bear Creek. When I arrived late Friday afternoon, the sun was already low, casting long shadows over the still forest. The cabin was small, made of rough-cut logs, with a stone chimney and a front porch that creaked under my steps. There was a woodpile stacked by the side, a hand pump well, and no electricity or running water inside. Exactly what I had wanted. After unpacking, I started a fire in the old cast iron stove, and the warmth filled the tiny room quickly. Outside, the wind whispered through the branches, and the only sounds were the crackling fire and distant bird calls. I ate a simple dinner of canned beans warmed on the stove, then settled down to read a book I had brought. The air was crisp, the kind that felt sharp in your lungs and made you breathe deeper. I slept that night under a thick wool blanket, feeling oddly comforted by the solitude. Saturday morning, I woke early to a pale gray sky. The wind had picked up overnight, and there was a chill in the air. After boiling water on the stove for coffee, I stepped outside. The lake was quiet, mirror still except for ripples where a few ducks floated. The forest around was dense and silent except for the wind in the pines. I spent the day hiking a narrow trail I found on a map stuck to the cabin wall. The woods were thick with moss and fallen leaves, and the scent of wet earth and pine was strong. As the afternoon wore on, the clouds thickened. I headed back to the cabin just as the first drops of rain started to fall. Inside, I lit the stove again, hoping to dry out my boots by the fire. The rain grew heavier, turning into a steady drizzle. The sound of rain hitting the metal roof was soothing at first, but after a few hours it began to wear on me. It was then that I noticed something odd. The wind had stopped, and with it, the usual creaking and rustling of the trees. Everything outside was dead silent, like the forest was holding its breath. Around 6 p.m., the power of the storm increased. The rain was pounding harder, and gusts of wind pushed the cabin. Suddenly, a loud cracking sound came from outside, like a tree breaking. I grabbed my flashlight and carefully went to the window. In the dim gray light, I saw a large tree had fallen across the small dirt path leading to the cabin. The trunk was thick, and the branches sprawled like giant fingers blocking the only way out. I felt a chill, but I told myself it was nothing. Trees fall in storms all the time. I could stay the night and wait for the storm to pass. I stacked more wood in the stove and made a simple dinner again, listening to the rain and watching the shadows dance on the walls. Later, around 10 p.m., I started to hear faint sounds outside. At first, I thought it was the wind or maybe animals, the typical noises of the forest at night. But the sounds were irregular, almost like footsteps in the wet leaves. I grabbed my flashlight again and cautiously stepped onto the porch. The rain had eased to a drizzle, and the wind was back, but the footsteps stopped as soon as I came out. I shined the light into the woods, but all I could see were dark trunks and moving shadows. The feeling in my chest tightened, a mix of fear and alertness. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe it was a deer or some other animal. The forest was alive after all. But the footsteps had sounded too deliberate, too heavy for a small animal. I double-checked all the windows and locked the cabin door, then sat by the stove, the flashlight close in case I needed it again. Around midnight, I was about to fall asleep when I heard it again. This time, it was louder, slow, heavy steps coming from the back of the cabin. I could hear twigs snapping, leaves crunching under boots or shoes. My heart pounded. I grabbed my hunting knife from the table. I always brought it with me, just in case, and moved silently toward the back door. Peeking out, I saw nothing but shadows and thick forest. The steps had stopped, and the silence returned. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, maybe a trick of the wind or animals shifting in the brush. Still, I stayed awake the rest of the night, too afraid to sleep deeply. Sunday morning came with pale light filtering through the rain-streaked windows. The storm had passed, but the air was thick and heavy, and a mist curled among the trees. I decided I had to clear the fallen tree to get back on the road. I packed a small saw I had brought for emergencies, put on my boots, and stepped outside. The tree was even bigger in daylight. Its trunk was massive, at least 2 feet across, and it blocked the only path. I started sawing carefully, making sure the saw didn't slip on wet bark. The air smelled of damp wood and earth. Birds began to sing again, and the forest felt alive once more. While cutting, I kept thinking about the footsteps from the night before. What if someone else was in the woods? The idea made my skin crawl. I had told no one where I was coming, no friends or family. If someone was here, why? I finished cutting a large branch and dragged it off the path. Then I heard it again, from deeper in the woods. A heavy footstep, slow and purposeful. I froze, holding the saw tight. It was coming closer, moving steadily through the undergrowth. I turned toward the cabin, suddenly feeling vulnerable and exposed. Then something moved between the trees. A figure, tall and broad-shouldered, stepped into the clearing. I didn't recognize the face at first. He was dressed in a heavy jacket and worn jeans, muddy boots, and his hair was messy from the rain. His eyes were hard and calculating. Without thinking, I stepped back, raised my voice as loud as I could, and shouted. The man hesitated, then turned and disappeared quickly into the woods. I didn't wait to see if he'd come back. I rushed inside, locked the doors, and called 911 on my cell phone, which I had been keeping off all weekend. Somehow, I still had a signal near the road. The police arrived an hour later. They said there had been reports of a man breaking into cabins and stealing supplies around the area. They searched the woods but found no one. I told them about the footprints and the figure I saw. The officers reassured me and offered to escort me back to my car. As I drove away from the cabin, I looked back once. The forest was calm, peaceful, but I felt a heavy weight in my chest. I realized how close I had come to real danger. Not from ghosts or legends, but from a very real person with bad intentions. Back in Boston, I felt different. The cabin trip had given me peace in some ways, but also a sharp reminder that nature and isolation come with risks. I never went back to that cabin again. Instead, I learned that sometimes the scariest things aren't made-up stories, but real moments where you have to trust your instincts to stay safe. That trip taught me the value of being prepared, aware, and never taking safety for granted. I still go camping, but I make sure someone knows exactly where I am, and I carry extra gear. That weekend in 1998 was one of the most intense experiences of my life, and while I escaped without harm, it left a mark I carry with me to this day. It was late October in 2014 when I decided to spend a few days alone at a small cabin near the edge of the Cascade Mountains in Washington State. I was 29 years old then, and after a stressful year working in the city as a graphic designer, I felt the need to get away from everything. The cabin was owned by an old family friend who had lent it to me for a week. It was a simple wooden cabin, built decades ago, with no electricity or running water, but with a wood stove and a well. The nearest town was about 20 miles away, and cell phone service was spotty at best. I wanted to disconnect, clear my head, and just be alone with the wilderness for a bit. The drive up was long but peaceful. The autumn leaves were turning bright shades of red, orange, and yellow, covering the roadsides and hills. The air smelled crisp and fresh. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, the sun was low, casting long shadows over the forest. The cabin sat on a small clearing surrounded by tall pines and fir trees. A narrow dirt path led down a gentle slope to a small lake where I planned to fish. The cabin looked exactly as I expected. Weathered wood, a rusty metal roof, a small porch with a couple of rocking chairs. Inside, there was a simple table, 2 chairs, a bed with a thick wool blanket, and the wood stove. The place smelled like pine and dust, but it felt comforting in a way. I unpacked my bag, bringing in a few canned goods, a small supply of firewood, a lantern, matches, and a simple first aid kit. I was prepared for the basics, but didn't want to overdo it. The first night, I made a fire in the stove and cooked some canned soup over it. Outside, the forest was quiet, except for the occasional rustling of leaves and distant calls of owls. The darkness was thick, and the only light came from the flickering fire inside. I felt a strange mix of calm and unease, a feeling I wasn't used to. The city was noisy and crowded, but out here, the silence was almost heavy. I went to bed early, tired from the drive and the fresh air. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds chirping and the sun filtering through the small window. The air was chilly, and I could see my breath inside the cabin. After a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal and coffee heated on the stove, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. I wanted to find a good fishing spot and maybe hike a bit. Walking through the forest, I noticed how different everything was. No cars, no buildings, just trees and rocks and the occasional fallen log. The ground was soft with pine needles, and the smell of damp earth filled the air. I followed a faint trail that led downhill toward the lake. As I got closer, I could hear the gentle lapping of water against the shore. The lake was small but beautiful, surrounded by trees that reflected perfectly in the still water. I found a spot where the bank was clear and sat down to fish. I didn't catch anything the first day, but I enjoyed the peace and the feeling of being completely alone. I took pictures with my phone when I got a signal and made notes in a small journal I'd brought. That night, I repeated my routine: firewood, stove, simple food, and early to bed. The second night was colder, and I wrapped myself tightly in the wool blanket. Outside, the wind picked up, making the trees creak and groan. It was a reminder that I was deep in the wilderness, far from help or comfort. On the third day, things started to feel a little different. I went to the lake again in the morning, hoping for a better catch, but the fish seemed to have disappeared. The water was colder than before, and a thick layer of mist hovered above the surface. I didn't see any animals, no birds, no squirrels, no signs of life except the rustling of the trees. It was as if the forest had gone quiet all at once. In the afternoon, I noticed some footprints near the cabin, just outside the back door. They were fresh and looked like they came from a heavy boot. I was sure no one else was supposed to be there. The only people for miles were hunters, but it was too early in the season for most of them. I felt a flicker of unease, but told myself it was probably just some local checking the area or a ranger. I checked the perimeter, walking slowly around the cabin, looking for more signs. There were none. No other footprints, no broken branches, no trash or anything left behind. Still, the feeling that I wasn't alone settled in my chest. That evening, I made sure to lock the cabin door and stack extra firewood by the entrance. I kept the lantern lit longer and sat by the stove, feeling the warmth spread through the small room. I tried to focus on the quiet and the solitude, but my mind kept drifting back to those footprints. Later that night, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard a noise outside. At first, it was faint, a soft thud, like something heavy hitting the ground. Then, a crunch of dry leaves underfoot, slow and deliberate. I froze, listening. The noise stopped near the porch. I didn't dare look out the window, but my heart was pounding. I grabbed the flashlight and checked the door. It was locked tight. I stayed awake for hours, half expecting to hear more. Nothing else came, and eventually exhaustion took over. The next morning, I found more footprints, this time circling the cabin. They were deep and heavy, definitely made by boots, and they seemed to move slowly, carefully avoiding some of the trees and bushes. Whoever had come by was watching the cabin closely. I decided it was time to leave, but my car was down the road and I had planned to pack later. I didn't want to risk walking down the dark forest trail alone, so I stayed inside and waited for daylight. As the day passed, I kept my eyes on the windows. The forest outside was alive again. Birds flew between branches, squirrels darted across the ground, but I never saw anyone. I considered calling the ranger station, but the signal was too weak for calls. On the third night, the feeling of being watched got worse. I kept hearing noises outside, the snap of twigs, rustling leaves, footsteps circling the cabin. The wind was stronger now, rattling the windows and shaking the roof. I piled more wood on the stove and sat close, trying to stay calm. Around midnight, the lantern flickered and died. I fumbled with the matches in the dark, my hands shaking. I managed to light it again, but my nerves were frayed. Suddenly, a loud bang hit the front door. I jumped up, heart racing. Someone was trying to get in. I shouted and banged on the walls, hoping to scare them off. The banging stopped after a few seconds, but the fear didn't. I sat back down, flashlight in hand, and kept the door locked. I stayed awake all night. The next morning, I found fresh scratches on the door frame and deep gouges in the wood near the handle. Someone had tried hard to break in. The footprints were still there around the cabin, but no sign of the person. I called the ranger station with the weak signal and told them what happened. They promised to send someone out the next day. I tried to stay calm, but I felt trapped. I wanted to leave immediately, but the forest was thick and the path down to the car was long and unsafe in the dark. That day, I gathered all my things quickly, keeping the door locked behind me. I took my flashlight, my journal, and the small knife I always carried for camping. I stayed close to the cabin, listening for any sounds, watching the trees. As the sun started to set, I made my move. I took the trail back to the car, walking fast but quietly. The forest was alive with sounds, but I didn't stop. My heart was pounding. Every shadow seemed like a threat. When I finally reached the clearing where my car was parked, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. I didn't hesitate. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. The headlights cut through the dark as I backed out. I didn't stop until I was back on the main road, the lights of the town shining ahead. I called the police and told them everything. They took a report, but there was nothing they could do without more evidence. I never went back to that cabin. I didn't want to know who had been watching me or why. The experience stayed with me for years, a reminder that the wilderness can be beautiful and peaceful, but also dangerous and unpredictable. Looking back, I think the person was just a hunter or someone who wanted the cabin for themselves. Maybe they were watching, waiting for me to leave so they could take it. Or maybe they just liked to scare people. Whatever the reason, I was lucky to get out when I did. The forest kept its secrets, but I learned to trust my instincts. Sometimes the scariest things aren't monsters or ghosts. They're real people with real intentions, hiding in the dark. It was the summer of 1998 when I decided to spend a week alone at a small cabin deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. I was 29 years old then, and I had been working long hours in the city for years. I wanted to get away from everything, away from the noise, the people, and the endless demands of my job. The idea was simple. Just me, the forest, and the silence. No distractions, no interruptions, just peace. The cabin was small, maybe 400 square feet, made of old pine logs with a metal roof that clanged when the wind blew. It was built in the early 60s by a man who had long passed away, but the place was still sturdy. The porch sagged slightly on one side, and the windows were dusty, but inside the cabin smelled like wood and earth, a comforting smell. There was a small wood stove in the corner, a simple table with 2 chairs, and a bed with a thin mattress. The cabin had no electricity or running water. I brought a lantern, a small gas stove, and plenty of bottled water. I arrived late in the afternoon. The dirt road leading to the cabin was rough and narrow, lined with towering pine and birch trees. The sun was just starting to lower behind the hills. As I parked my old pickup truck near the cabin, I felt a strange mix of excitement and unease. I told myself it was just the unfamiliar place settling in my mind. I spent the first evening unpacking my supplies, stacking firewood, and checking the cabin carefully. The walls were solid, but I noticed some small gaps between the logs where cold air might slip in during the night. I sealed a few of these with some spare cloth and mud. I lit the wood stove and boiled some water for dinner, canned beans and bread. The night fell quickly, and the darkness outside felt complete, almost suffocating. No city lights, no street sounds, only the occasional call of an owl or the rustle of leaves in the wind. That first night was harder than I expected. The silence was not peaceful but heavy. I lay awake on the thin mattress, listening closely to every sound. The trees creaked, the wind howled softly, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. My mind wandered to stories I had heard about isolated cabins and people disappearing or encountering trouble. I told myself it was nonsense, just nature doing its thing. The next day, I explored the area around the cabin. There was a small creek about a quarter-mile away and a narrow trail that wound through the forest. I collected some dry branches for the fire, and I tried to keep busy to avoid the creeping boredom. The forest was beautiful but dense, and I quickly learned not to wander too far. The trees all looked similar, and it was easy to lose your way if you weren't paying attention. On the third day, strange things started happening. I first noticed it while I was preparing lunch on the gas stove. I had set the stove on a small wooden table just outside the cabin door. I turned my back for a moment to check my supplies inside. When I looked back, the stove had been knocked over. The pot of boiling water had spilled and soaked the table and the ground beneath it. I was sure I had set it down carefully. No wind blew strong enough to topple it. I shrugged it off as my mistake and cleaned up. Later that afternoon, I heard noises near the cabin. At first, I thought it was a deer or some other animal rummaging through the underbrush. But the sound was different, more deliberate, like footsteps or someone moving quietly through the trees. I grabbed a flashlight and walked carefully around the cabin. I saw nothing but broken branches and disturbed leaves. No footprints, no signs of an animal. That night, the unease grew. I checked the locks on the cabin door and windows. I made sure to keep the lantern close. I tried not to let fear take hold, but every noise, every shadow seemed larger than before. At one point, I heard a soft knock on the door. I froze. The knock came again, faint but clear. I did not answer. Instead, I grabbed my flashlight and peered out the window. Nothing. No one was there. Days passed and the incidents continued. Small things. Food missing from my supplies, footprints around the cabin, a campfire nearby that wasn't mine. I started to feel watched. The forest that had seemed beautiful and peaceful was now oppressive and dark. I knew there was someone or something nearby, but I didn't see or hear anyone clearly. The feeling of being stalked was constant. I thought about leaving. I had a phone in my truck, but the signal was weak and unreliable. I tried calling for help, but no one answered. The nearest town was miles away, and I had no vehicle to go back at night. I was trapped. On the fifth day, things took a serious turn. I woke up to find that the cabin door was slightly open. I was sure I had locked it the night before. Inside, the small wooden table was overturned, and my few belongings were scattered on the floor. My food was gone, every last bit. The firewood pile was disturbed. Someone had been inside while I slept. I packed up what I could carry quickly. I had a backpack with essentials, water, some canned food, a flashlight, a small pocket knife. I didn't want to confront whoever was there, but I had to get out. I planned to hike to the main road, about 3 miles away. I waited until just before dawn. The forest was silent, and the sky was a dull gray. I slipped out quietly and began walking. The forest trail was narrow and uneven, but I moved fast. I kept my eyes open for any signs of movement. Every snapped twig made me jump. After about an hour, I heard voices, distant, muffled, but definitely human. I crouched behind a large rock and waited. A group of men came through the trees, carrying hunting rifles and packs. They wore dirty clothes and had tired faces. They didn't see me. I stayed hidden until they passed. The rest of the hike was tense but uneventful. When I finally reached the road, I flagged down a passing car. The driver was a kind woman who called the police for me. I returned to the cabin with law enforcement a few days later. They found signs of others living near the cabin: makeshift campsites, discarded food cans, and broken bottles. The men I saw were part of a group of squatters living illegally in the woods. They had been watching the cabin, waiting for someone to come and leave so they could take it over. The police told me the area was known for this kind of trespassing. People looking for a place to hide, often armed, sometimes dangerous. They advised me not to return alone. I felt shaken but relieved. The woods were not haunted by ghosts, but by desperate people trying to survive in their own way, sometimes crossing the line. The fear I felt was real and grounded in the danger of human actions, not fantasy. I never went back to that cabin again, but the experience taught me something important. Nature can be harsh and isolating, but sometimes the scariest thing out there is another human being. I learned to respect the quiet, but also to be aware of the world beyond the trees. It was the summer of 2009 when I decided to spend a week alone at a cabin deep in the woods of northern Vermont. I was 27 then, needing a break from the constant noise of city life in Boston. I'd grown up camping a little as a kid, but this was my first time planning a solo trip that long in complete isolation. The cabin was modest, just a small wooden structure perched on the edge of a clearing near a dense forest. The owner had told me it had no electricity or running water, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. It was exactly what I wanted. No distractions, no interruptions, just me and the wilderness. I arrived late in the afternoon after a long drive up winding, narrow roads that seemed to disappear into nothing but trees. The air smelled fresh, filled with pine and wet earth. The cabin looked exactly as the owner had described. weathered wood, a stone chimney, a small porch with a creaky wooden chair. I parked the car by a rough dirt path leading up to the cabin and unloaded my backpack slowly, careful not to hurry. I wanted to get used to the quiet right away to take it all in. Inside, the cabin was basic but clean. A small kitchen corner with a propane stove, a wooden table and 2 chairs, a simple bed covered in thick blankets, and a wood stove that looked like it had seen many winters. A single window faced the forest. I set down my things and opened the window to let in the cool evening air. The sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and the occasional rustle of small animals. Everything felt peaceful, like I'd found a secret place the world had forgotten. That first night, I cooked a simple dinner over the stove, canned beans and rice, and then sat by the window with a book. Outside, the dark grew thick fast. The stars appeared one by one, sharp and bright in the clear sky. I could hear the distant call of an owl and the soft snapping of twigs somewhere close by. The woods were full of life, even at night, but there was also a stillness, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I slept soundly, wrapped in the blankets, comforted by the silence. When I woke the next morning, the cabin was flooded with sunlight. The air smelled damp from overnight dew. I made coffee on the stove and sat on the porch, watching the forest wake up. A few squirrels darted between the trees, and a woodpecker tapped rhythmically somewhere off to the left. I planned my day carefully, intending to explore the trails the owner had mentioned. The trails were narrow paths weaving through the thick forest, lined with ferns and moss-covered rocks. I walked for hours, my boots crunching on fallen leaves and pine needles. I didn't see another person all day, only the occasional deer bounding away into the underbrush. The air was cool but not cold, and the sun filtered through the trees in golden beams. I found a small stream where I refilled my water bottle, the water cold and fresh. By afternoon, I was tired but content, so I headed back to the cabin. That night, something changed. As I sat inside the cabin reading, I heard a faint sound outside, a snapping branch, like something or someone was moving in the trees. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal, but the noise was closer than before. The wind had picked up, rattling the window panes. I closed the curtains and checked that the door was locked. The feeling of being watched crept over me, a prickly unease that I hadn't felt before. I tried to focus on my book, but every little noise made me jump. The next day, I decided to leave the trails and instead explore the edge of the forest near the cabin. I wanted to find the boundary between the clearing and the thick trees. As I walked, I noticed the trees growing denser, their trunks twisted and gnarled. The light dimmed beneath the canopy. I found old footprints in the dirt, too big for any deer, too human. The prints were fresh, maybe a day or 2 old. A chill ran down my spine. I hadn't expected anyone else to be here. I considered going back immediately but decided to follow the prints a little further, curiosity getting the better of me. The footprints led to an old dirt road barely visible beneath leaves and branches. I remembered the owner saying there had been logging here years ago before the area became protected. The road looked abandoned, cracked, and overgrown, but definitely made by heavy vehicles. Suddenly, I heard the distinct sound of a vehicle engine in the distance. It was faint, but unmistakable. I froze. No one was supposed to be nearby. The noise didn't last long, and when I looked around, I saw nothing. That night, back in the cabin, I was restless. The feeling of being watched was stronger, and I couldn't shake it. I stayed near the wood stove, my eyes darting to every shadow. I double-checked the locks again. The wind howled outside, and the branches scratched at the windows. Then I heard it, a soft knocking on the door. Not a bang, but a quiet, deliberate knock. My heart hammered. I stared at the door for a long moment, debating whether to open it or not. The knocking stopped. I waited another 10 minutes, then slowly moved to the door and looked through the peephole. No one was there. Couldn't sleep that night. The knocking haunted me, as did the footprints and the engine noise. The next morning, I packed up quickly. I wanted to leave before anything else happened. But as I locked the cabin door, I noticed something carved into the wooden frame. A series of marks, straight lines, and symbols I didn't recognize. They looked fresh, the wood still light where it had been scraped. I had never seen anything like it. My skin crawled. I got in the car and started down the dirt road. But the dirt road was blocked. Fallen trees lay across it, heavy and freshly cut. I tried to move them, but they were too big. I realized then that someone had been here recently and had blocked my only way out. Panic rose in my chest. I tried calling for help on my phone, but there was no signal. I was completely cut off. The car's engine started, but I couldn't drive forward. I was trapped. I spent the day clearing smaller branches and scouting for another way out. The forest was thick and tangled, and every direction looked the same. As night fell, I decided to stay in the car. I locked the doors and sat quietly, listening to the woods. The knocking returned, this time on the car window. I didn't look. Kept happening all night, slow and deliberate. The next morning, I found a nearby ranger station marked on my old map. It was several miles away, but it was my only hope. I took my backpack and started walking along the forest edge. The woods seemed to close in on me, every shadow twisting into shapes my mind tried to recognize. I kept hearing footsteps behind me, but when I stopped, there was nothing. I walked fast, heart pounding. After hours, I reached a small dirt road and followed it uphill. The sun was setting when I finally saw the ranger station, a small wooden building with a radio antenna. I knocked on the door desperately. A ranger opened, surprised to see me. I told him what happened, the blocked road, the knocking, the footprints, the strange marks. He called for backup and we drove back together. When we reached the cabin, the fallen trees were still there, but the marks on the doorframe had been partially erased by rain. We found no one, no sign of who had been watching or blocking me. The ranger explained that the area was popular with illegal loggers and poachers who sometimes scared off visitors. I realized that the knocking and noises were probably someone trying to intimidate me, to keep me away. No ghosts, no magic, just people hidden and dangerous in the forest. I never returned to that cabin, but the experience taught me something important. Nature isn't always peaceful and quiet. Sometimes the scariest things are real, grounded in human fear and cruelty. And when you're alone in the woods, you have to be ready for anything. The air was still as I pulled my old Jeep onto the narrow dirt road leading to the cabin. The year was 2007, and I was 34 years old. It had been a long time since I'd been alone in the woods like this. The cabin sat at the edge of a thick forest in northern Vermont, just a few miles from the small town of Barr. My grandfather had owned the place before me, and after he passed, I decided to spend a week there to clear my head. I needed a break from the city, from the noise and endless demands of work and life. Just me, the trees, and the quiet. The sun was setting low, casting long shadows over the dense pine trees that lined the road. I drove slowly, feeling the crunch of gravel under my tires and watching the light fade. The cabin came into view as I rounded the last bend. A simple, weathered structure with faded wood siding and a small porch that looked out over a shallow stream. Smoke curled faintly from the stone chimney, evidence that the place had been prepared for my arrival. My grandfather's old caretaker, Mrs. Doyle, had left the fire going before she locked up the place a few days earlier. I parked and stepped out, stretching my stiff muscles after the long drive. The smell of pine needles mixed with the damp earth filled my lungs. The silence was thick, broken only by the distant call of a crow and the gentle trickle of the stream nearby. I grabbed my bags and headed inside, closing the creaking door behind me. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and faint smoke. The floors were worn but clean, the furniture simple and sturdy. A small kitchen sat in one corner with a wood stove and a metal sink. On the walls hung a few faded photographs of my grandfather, some hunting trophies, and a map of the surrounding forest. I set down my bags and walked to the window, looking out as the last rays of sunlight slipped behind the trees. The plan was simple. Spend the week alone, hiking during the day, reading at night and sleeping early. No phone calls, no emails, no distractions. just the way I needed it. After unpacking, I went outside to gather some firewood. The air had cooled quickly with the coming night, and the forest had grown darker, the shadows deeper. I stacked the logs neatly next to the porch, careful to keep them dry under the small overhang. When I went back inside, I stoked the fire, watching the flames catch and warm the room with a soft orange glow. The night was quiet. I lay on the creaky bed, listening to the faint sounds of animals moving outside. Somewhere in the distance, a barred owl called, its hoot echoing between the trees. I felt a calm settle over me, my city worries slipping away. The next morning, I woke early to the soft light filtering through the window. I brewed some coffee over the stove and ate a simple breakfast of toast and canned beans. Then I packed a small backpack with water, a map, and a first aid kit, and set off into the woods. The forest was dense but familiar from stories my grandfather had told me. Tall pines and maples stretched skyward, their branches rustling softly in the light breeze. The ground was soft with moss and fallen leaves. I followed a narrow trail that led uphill, stopping occasionally to look back at the cabin, small and distant now among the trees. Hours passed as I walked deeper into the forest. I admired the quiet beauty, the way sunlight dappled the leaves, the sudden flash of a squirrel darting across the path, the gentle buzz of insects. I felt peaceful, grounded, connected to something older and slower than the rush of daily life. On the third day, though, something felt off. I was up early again, heading out for a longer hike toward a ridge my grandfather had marked on the map. The sky was gray and heavy with clouds, and the wind had picked up, making the trees groan softly. As I followed the trail, I noticed broken branches and crushed undergrowth near the path, signs of something large moving through the forest recently. It wasn't unusual to see deer or maybe a bear here, but the tracks I found were different, larger, and more chaotic. They seemed fresh. A sense of unease crept over me. I tightened my jacket and kept walking, telling myself it was just animals and nothing to worry about. But I was alert, listening closely for any sound beyond the wind or birds. When I reached the ridge, the view opened up. Below, the forest stretched out endlessly, a sea of green and brown under the heavy sky. I paused to catch my breath, taking in the quiet beauty. But then I heard it, a sharp crack from the trees behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, but saw nothing. No movement, no shape, just the swaying branches and falling leaves. I called out, but my voice sounded small and lost in the vast woods. The wind caught my words and scattered them. There was nothing, no answer. I decided to head back quickly, feeling the weight of that silence pressing in. The trail seemed longer on the way down, the shadows deeper and the air colder. I kept glancing over my shoulder, though nothing ever appeared. I tried to stay calm, steadying my breath and focusing on my footing. Back at the cabin, I closed the door firmly and double-checked the locks. The fire was low, so I added more wood, watching the flames crackle and glow. Outside, the wind had picked up into a howl, rattling the windows and bending the trees. The forest seemed alive in a way it hadn't before. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every little sound made me jump. The creak of the cabin, the scrape of branches against the roof, the distant howl of a coyote. I kept the fire going as long as I could, but eventually, it burned out. I sat in the dark, trying to remind myself it was all natural sounds, nothing more. On the fourth day, the weather turned colder and wetter. Rain fell steadily, tapping on the roof and turning the dirt road into mud. I stayed inside mostly, reading and fixing small things around the cabin. I found my grandfather's old hunting rifle in the closet and cleaned it carefully, just in case. I'd never used a gun much, but the feeling of having it close brought a little comfort. The forest outside was blurred by the rain, shadows shifting under the gray sky. I noticed more broken branches and fresh tracks around the cabin, closer this time. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. I stopped going far on hikes, sticking to the nearby trails and always watching the edges of the trees. On the fifth day, the power went out in the nearby town. I didn't have electricity in the cabin anyway, but I noticed my old radio was silent. I tried the emergency channels, but all was quiet. I was completely cut off, surrounded by the forest with no way to call for help. That night, the wind was fierce. It tore through the trees, making them groan and shake. The rain lashed against the windows, and I could hear something scraping outside. Branches rubbing against the cabin, slow and deliberate. I stayed close to the door, rifle in hand, my heart racing. Then, around midnight, I heard footsteps outside. Slow, heavy steps circling the cabin. I froze, holding my breath, eyes wide in the dark. The steps stopped for a moment, then moved on. I waited for what felt like hours, the silence thick and unbearable. At first light, I went outside carefully, looking for signs of whoever or whatever had been there. There were clear footprints in the wet mud, large and uneven, not like an animal's paw but human boots. Someone had been around the cabin, watching. I packed quickly, knowing I couldn't stay another night. I locked up as best as I could and started the Jeep, heart pounding as I looked into the trees. The forest seemed to close in around me, dark and watching. I didn't look back as I drove down the road, the cabin shrinking behind me into the mist. By the time I reached Bar, the sun was breaking through the clouds. The town was quiet, but the people looked at me strangely, like they knew something I didn't. I didn't stop for anything until I was back on the highway, speeding toward the city. I never went back to that cabin. Later, I learned that others in the area had reported strange people in the woods, hunters, trespassers, maybe worse. The forest was a place people came to hide, and sometimes those shadows weren't just animals or wind. But I was lucky. I got away before anything worse happened. The silence of the woods was broken, but I was still here, alive and away from those dark eyes watching just beyond the trees. I carry that week with me, a reminder that nature isn't always peaceful and quiet, and sometimes the scariest things don't come from ghosts or stories. They come from real people and the unknown waiting in the wild. It was the autumn of 2018 when I decided to take a break from my life in the city. My name is Mark. I was 34 then, and the constant noise and rush of New York had worn me down. I needed some time alone, somewhere quiet, far away from the crowded streets, the blaring horns, and the never-ending chatter. I wanted peace, and the idea of renting a small cabin in the woods came to me after some online browsing. I found one that looked perfect. An old but sturdy cabin on the edge of a forest in northern Vermont, near a small town called Lyndonville. It wasn't fancy, but it was isolated, surrounded by thick trees, and had no neighbors close by. Exactly what I wanted. The owner was an elderly man named Mr. Collins. We exchanged a few emails to finalize the booking, and I was set to spend 2 weeks there, alone with just my books, some food supplies, and my laptop. I told myself I'd use the time to write a few articles and read, maybe even hike around a bit. I was used to being alone. It was just that I hadn't been this far away from people in a long time. The cabin had no cell service and Wi-Fi was spotty at best, but that was part of the appeal. I drove up from New York early on a crisp October morning. The air was chilly but clear, with that sharp autumn smell. Damp earth, fallen leaves, and pine. The roads got narrower and less traveled the further north I went, until finally, I turned onto a gravel path marked Cabin Rentals on a faded wooden sign. The cabin stood a short walk off the road, surrounded by tall oaks and maples, their leaves turning brilliant shades of orange, red, and yellow. The cabin itself was simple, a single-story wooden structure with a small porch, a stone chimney, and windows with white curtains. Inside, it smelled faintly of wood smoke and pine resin. There was a fireplace, a small kitchen with basic appliances, a table, a couple of chairs, and a single bed in a corner. A small pile of firewood sat stacked neatly outside. The first day passed quietly. I unpacked my things, made a fire, and settled in. The silence was heavy but comforting. I spent the day reading and jotting down notes on my laptop, stopping only to prepare simple meals. At night, the forest outside was a black wall, but I liked the feeling of being surrounded by it. On the second day, I decided to explore a little. The forest was dense, with narrow trails winding between tall trees and thick undergrowth. The ground was covered in a carpet of dry leaves that crunched underfoot. I didn't stray far, just walked around the immediate area, breathing the fresh air, listening to the occasional bird call and the rustling of small animals. The quiet was only interrupted by the distant sound of a stream. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the wind pick up. The branches scraped against the windows, and the chimney rattled softly. It was a comforting sound, like the forest was alive, watching over the cabin. I drifted to sleep feeling calm. The third day began with a gray sky and a hint of rain. I stayed inside, writing and reading. The cabin felt warm and snug despite the chill outside. The rain started late afternoon, steady and soft, tapping on the roof and windows. It gave the place a cozy atmosphere. I built a fire and sat close to it, sipping coffee and listening to the rain. The following morning, the rain had stopped, but the air was damp and heavy. When I stepped outside, the forest floor was wet and muddy. I noticed something odd near the edge of the clearing where the cabin stood. There were footprints, large, deep impressions in the soft earth, leading from the forest toward the cabin and then back again. The prints were too big for any deer or dog I knew. They looked like boots. I hadn't seen or heard anyone all day, and the cabin was supposed to be isolated. My first thought was maybe a hunter or a hiker had passed through, but no one told me about any nearby trails. Still, I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Over the next 2 days, the feeling of being watched crept in slowly. I noticed small things. A rock moved slightly out of place on the porch. The firewood pile seemed disturbed even though I hadn't taken any wood out. And at night, the wind carried faint noises. Crackling branches, the snap of twigs, footsteps sometimes. But whenever I looked out the window, there was no one there. I told myself it was just the forest, natural sounds, my imagination playing tricks. But the unease lingered. On the 5th day, I went for a longer hike. I followed a narrow trail that ran alongside a small river. The water was clear and cold, rushing over rocks and fallen logs. The forest around me was quiet except for the water and my footsteps. After about an hour, I found an old hunting cabin, abandoned and weathered, with a collapsed roof and broken windows. The door was hanging open, and inside, I saw rusted cans, an old stove, and torn blankets. I felt a sudden chill, but I took a few photos and left quickly. Something about the place felt wrong, like it hadn't been abandoned naturally but rather left in a hurry. That evening, back at my cabin, I found a note slipped under the door. It was handwritten in rough, hurried letters. "Leave now." My heart raced. I looked around outside, no sign of anyone. I checked the windows and locked the doors. I wanted to call someone, but there was no cell signal, and the cabin's phone line was dead. The nearest house was miles away, and I hadn't met anyone nearby. I stayed up late, listening. The forest was alive with sounds, but nothing unusual except that I could swear I heard voices, faint and distant, carried on the wind. I told myself it was just the rain from earlier or animals. Still, I didn't sleep well. The next day, I found more signs that someone had been around. The firewood pile was scattered, some logs missing. My trash bag was torn open, food wrappers scattered. I was careful to clean up, but it was clear someone was near the cabin, maybe watching me. I wanted to leave but felt stuck. The roads were muddy from rain, and my car was parked down the hill on the gravel path. I needed more time to pack safely. I decided to explore the nearby road again, hoping to find a neighbor or a phone. As I walked, I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling the weight of eyes on me. The sun was low when I reached the main road, but it was deserted. The houses were empty, the town silent. A few doors were unlocked, but no one was home. The streetlights flickered on as night fell. That night was the worst. Around midnight, I heard footsteps crunching through the leaves outside, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. I sat in the dark, heart pounding, listening to the soft but unmistakable sound. Then a rock hit the window, rattling it sharply. I grabbed a heavy lamp and shined the light outside, but there was no one. The footsteps stopped. I considered yelling or making noise, but I was alone and scared. The cabin felt like a trap. I stayed up all night, fire burning low, every shadow on the walls turning into a threat. Morning came, and with it, a thin fog hanging low over the trees. I packed quickly, threw my things into the car, and locked the cabin door. I didn't look back as I drove down the gravel road, mud splashing my tires. The feeling of being watched stayed with me the whole way. When I reached the main highway, I stopped at a gas station to call Mr. Collins. I told him what happened, but he sounded surprised and concerned. He explained that sometimes hunters came near the cabin, though they weren't supposed to. He said he'd look into it and promised to check the cabin soon. I didn't go back to the cabin after that. The experience stayed with me for a long time. The sense that someone had been close enough to see me, to watch and warn me, but never show themselves fully. The forest, quiet and beautiful by day, felt like it held secrets that no one wanted disturbed. Looking back, I think what scared me most wasn't any ghost or monster, but the real and raw feeling of being alone in a place where another human could be nearby, unknown, and possibly dangerous. The isolation was peaceful until it wasn't. And that's what made those days in that cabin some of the most unsettling of my life.